Virginia, 1816. Eleanor Whitmore sat perfectly still as her husband called her undecorative in front of 40 guests. She did not cry. She did not speak. She folded her napkin, rose from the table, and walked upstairs without a single word. By sunrise, her side of the bed was cold, her ledgers were gone, and so was she. If you believe a woman's worth is not decided by a man's cruelty, subscribe and stay with me until the very end, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from, so I can see how far this story has traveled. The candles in the Carter dining hall burned tall and steady, throwing gold light across crystal glasses and porcelain plates rimmed in blue. 40 guests filled the long table that summer evening. In 1816, the air thick with the smell of roasted pheasant and warm bread, the low hum of polite laughter rolling from one end of the room to the other. Eleanor Whitmore Carter sat near the head of the table, her spine straight, her hands folded in her lap, her gray-blue eyes moving quietly from face to face as she listened. She had learned over 3 years of marriage that silence was often safer than speech. Not because she had nothing to say, Eleanor had opinions on nearly everything from the price of tobacco to the mismanagement of the eastern fields, but because a woman who spoke too plainly in rooms like this one was rarely thanked for it. Beside her, Nathaniel Carter lifted his wineglass, the crystal catching the candlelight. He was 32, broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark green coat that had been tailored in Richmond, his jaw clean-shaven, his dark hair combed back with the kind of care that spoke of a man raised to be looked at. He was handsome in the way that made rooms quiet when he entered them. He was also, Eleanor had come to understand, a man who had never once been asked to consider what it cost a person to be looked past. "To new beginnings," Nathaniel said, raising his glass toward a young couple seated across the table. The Ashfords recently married the bride, glowing in blue silk. "May marriage bring you both what it has brought me." Laughter rippled around the table. Mrs. Ashford blushed. Her husband, a stout young man with an easy smile, raised his own glass in return. "And what has marriage brought you, Nathaniel?" asked old Colonel Whitfield from the far end of the table, his voice thick with drink and mischief. "Besides that fine estate of yours." Nathaniel smiled, the kind of smile that had charmed rooms since he was a boy. He glanced sideways at Eleanor, and for one breath she thought foolishly she would later realize that he might say something kind. That he might, in front of all these people, finally say the thing she had waited 3 years to hear. "A wife who understands her place," Nathaniel said. Instead, his voice light, almost fond, as though he were paying her a compliment. Fortunately, no one married Eleanor expecting her to be decorative. The table went still. Somewhere near the center, a fork clinked against a plate. Mrs. Ashford's smile faltered. The Colonel's laughter died in his throat. Margaret Carter, Nathaniel's mother, seated at his right hand in her customary black silk, let out a small, delicate laugh, the kind of laugh that agreed with her son, before her mind had even finished the thought. "Well," Margaret said, patting her lips with her napkin, "some women are simply better suited to ledgers than to lace." A few guests chuckled, uncertain, glancing toward Eleanor to see how she might respond. Eleanor felt every eye at that table settle on her at once, the way a held breath settles in a room before a storm. She did not flinch. She had spent that very afternoon in the study, hunched over the Eastern field accounts, until her fingers ached, discovering an error that would have cost the Carter estate nearly $400 had it gone uncorrected through the autumn harvest. She had ridden out herself in the heat to speak with the tenant farmers about drainage on the low fields because Nathaniel had been too occupied with his horses to attend to it. She had written the letters that kept the family's creditors patient. She had done in 3 years more for the survival of Carter land than anyone seated at that table understood or cared to know, and she had been called undecorative at her own table in front of 40 people by the man who had promised to honor her. Eleanor set down her wineglass. The sound of crystal against the tablecloth was soft, but in the silence of that room it seemed to carry. "I understand," she said quietly. That was all. 2 words. Her voice did not shake. She did not raise it. She simply spoke the way a person speaks when they have finally stopped waiting for something that was never coming. Nathaniel, misreading her calm for agreement, gave a short laugh and turned back to the table. already moving on to some remark about the Ashfords' honeymoon plans. Margaret smiled her thin, satisfied smile. The conversation resumed its low murmur, guests exchanging glances, but saying nothing the way people do when they have witnessed something they do not wish to name. Eleanor sat through the rest of the dinner in perfect stillness. She ate what was placed before her. She answered when spoken to. She smiled the practiced, polite smile she had learned to wear like a second skin. But behind that smile, something in her. Something that had been bending quietly for 3 years, finished bending, and did not spring back. When the last of the guests had gone, their carriages rattling away down the long gravel drive into the warm dark of the Virginia night, Eleanor climbed the stairs to her chamber alone. She did not wait for Nathaniel, who had stayed below with the last of the brandy and his mother's approving conversation. She closed her door softly behind her and stood for a long moment in the quiet, listening to her own breathing. Then she moved. She crossed to the wooden trunk at the foot of her bed, the one that had belonged to her father, its corners worn smooth with age, and opened it. Inside lay the thing she had brought with her into this marriage, and never once been asked to share her father's account books, his careful handwriting still visible on the yellowed pages. The deed records she had copied by candlelight, because no one else in the household could read a survey map correctly. Her own ledger, the one she kept in secret, recording every debt paid, every field planted, every dollar the estate owed to her quiet, unthanked labor. She packed methodically, without tears, without haste. A few dresses, her mother's small silver locket, the letters her father had written her before he died, urging her to trust her own mind, even in a world built to doubt it. She took nothing that was not hers. At her writing desk she paused only once to remove her wedding ring, setting it gently in the center of the polished wood where it would be found. Beside it, she left a single folded page. She had considered writing pages of explanation, of accusation, of grief. In the end, she wrote only one line in the same steady hand she used for her ledgers. I have gone somewhere my mind is considered useful. By the time the first gray light touched the fields beyond the Carter estate, Eleanor Whitmore was already 3 miles down the road, her trunk beside her in the borrowed cart, her father's ledgers pressed against her chest like something sacred. She did not look back at the house behind her. She had spent 3 years looking back, waiting for a version of her marriage that had never existed. She would not waste another morning on it. Nathaniel woke past 9, his head thick from brandy, the summer sun already high and warm against the curtains. He reached across the bed, out of habit, expecting the familiar shape of his wife beside him, and found only cool, empty sheets. He sat up slowly, frowning. Eleanor rose early most mornings, earlier than he liked, in truth always occupied with some account book or tenant matter before he had even dressed. But she was never gone from the room entirely. He called for her, his voice still rough with sleep, and received no answer. It was Sarah, the young housemaid, who found him minutes later standing in Eleanor's chamber, staring at the wedding ring resting in the center of the writing desk. "Mr. Carter," Sarah said softly, hovering in the doorway, twisting her apron in her hands. "Is something the matter?" Nathaniel did not answer at first. He picked up the folded page beside the ring, and Sarah watched his face change as he read it. Confusion first, then something sharper, something closer to disbelief. "Where is she?" he asked, his voice low. "I haven't seen her since last night, sir," Sarah said. "Her trunk is gone from the hall. I thought I assumed she'd told you she was traveling." "She didn't tell me anything," Nathaniel said. He read the note again, as though a second reading might change its meaning. "I have gone somewhere my mind is considered useful." He turned it over, searching for more, for an address, an explanation, a demand he could answer. There was nothing else. He found his mother in the breakfast room, already seated with her tea, her expression composed in the way it always was, no matter what news arrived. "Eleanor is gone," Nathaniel said, setting the note on the table before her. "She's taken her trunk, her ledgers. She left this." Margaret read the note without any visible alarm. She set it down and lifted her teacup with steady hands. "Well," she said, "I imagine she's gone to sulk somewhere. She'll return by week's end humbled once she realizes how few places will have her." "You don't understand," Nathaniel said, and something in his own voice surprised him, a note of urgency he had not expected to feel. She took the estate ledgers, the land deeds, the correspondence with the Richmond creditors. Margaret's teacup paused halfway to her lips. "Whatever for?" "I don't know," Nathaniel said, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he realized he did not know very much about his wife at all. Not where she might go, not who she might turn to, not what quiet architecture of competence she had built beneath the surface of a marriage he had barely bothered to examine. He thought briefly of the eastern fields of Eleanor riding out in the heat while he had stayed behind with his horses. He thought of the creditors who had more than once praised the clarity of a letter he had never actually written himself. He thought of 100 small moments he had accepted without asking who had made them possible, and a cold, unfamiliar feeling settled into his chest. "Fetch the carriage," he said to Sarah, who still hovered in the doorway. "I'm going into town. Someone must have seen which road she took." Tiang. Eleanor did not go to town. By midday, she had reached the crossroads that led south toward Richmond, where her cousin Margaret Ann Pruitt, no relation to the Carters, though the shared name had always amused Eleanor, privately kept a modest but respectable house near the edge of the city. Eleanor had written to her only once in the past year, a brief letter thanking her for a gift at Christmas, nothing more. She had no promise of welcome. She had only a memory of her cousin's kindness from girlhood, and the quiet certainty that she could not go back to the house she had left. The cart driver, an older man named Thomas, who worked the Carter land, and had agreed to take her as far as the crossroads, for a few coins glanced at her more than once during the journey, his weathered face creased with concern. "Beggin' your pardon, Mrs. Carter," he said finally as the cart rattled over a rutted stretch of road, "but a woman travelin' alone with a trunk full of ledgers, that ain't exactly usual." "No," Eleanor agreed. "It isn't. Mr. Carter know you're headed to Richmond." "Mr. Carter," Eleanor said, her voice even, "knows only that I am gone." Thomas said nothing more after that, though his frown deepened, and Eleanor understood that word would travel that by evening half the county would know that Eleanor Carter had left her husband, and by week's end every version of the story would be worse than the truth. She found to her own surprise that she did not care. She had spent 3 years shaping herself into a version of a wife that pleased everyone but herself. She was finished performing for an audience that had never truly seen her. When she arrived at her cousin's modest brick house that evening, dust-covered and exhausted, Margaret Ann Pruitt opened the door herself, her eyes widening at the sight of Eleanor standing on the step with a single trunk and no husband in sight. "Eleanor," she said, "good heavens, what's happened?" Eleanor stood very straight, her chin lifted, though her voice when it came was quieter than she intended. "I've left him, Margaret Ann. I don't expect you to understand it tonight. I only ask that you let me stay until I've found my footing." For a long moment her cousin said nothing, studying Eleanor's face in the fading light. The exhaustion there, yes, but also something else, something steadier than grief. Whatever she saw seemed to settle the matter. "Come inside," Margaret Ann said, stepping back from the door. "You'll tell me everything over supper. And Eleanor," she added as Eleanor lifted her trunk over the threshold, "whatever he did, I already suspect it was foolish. Men usually are when they think a woman's silence means she has nothing to say." The following days settled into a strange, quiet rhythm. Eleanor rose early out of habit, though there were no fields to inspect, no ledgers waiting on a desk that was not her own. She spent her mornings helping her cousin with small household accounts, her afternoons walking the streets of Richmond, observing the city, with the same careful attention she had once given the Carter estate, noting which shops seemed to struggle, which merchants kept careless books, which families whispered about land disputes over their garden fences. It was on her 4th day in the city that she overheard, quite by accident, a conversation that would change the shape of everything that followed. She had stopped at a small dry goods store to purchase thread for her cousin, and while she waited near the counter, 2 men stood arguing in low, frustrated voices near the door. A merchant named Josiah Fenwick and a younger man Eleanor did not recognize. "The surveyor's numbers don't match the deed," Fenwick was saying, his voice tight with worry. If I can't prove the boundary by autumn, Whitcomb means to take the northern acres. 20 years I've farmed that land, and now some clerk's error is going to hand it to a man who's never once turned the soil himself. Have you shown the deed to anyone who might make sense of it? The younger man asked. I've shown it to every lawyer in this city, Fenwick said bitterly. None of them can be bothered with a small dispute like mine when there are wealthier men needing their attention. Eleanor stood very still near the counter, her thread forgotten in her hand. She had read 100 deeds like the one Fenwick likely held. She had spent 3 years untangling exactly this kind of confusion for the Carter estate, correcting surveyor errors that clerks were too careless or too rushed to catch. She understood in that moment, with a clarity that startled her, that the skill she had spent years using in service of a man who called her undecorative was a skill that mattered, that other people, ordinary people, desperately needed. She approached the counter before she could talk herself out of it. "Forgive my intrusion," she said, addressing Fenwick directly, her voice steady, despite the flutter of nerves in her chest. "I couldn't help but overhear. I've had considerable experience with land deeds and survey discrepancies. If you would permit me to examine the document, I may be able to help you understand where the error lies." Fenwick turned, taking in the sight of her, a woman alone, dressed plainly but neatly, her hands ink-stained from years of careful bookkeeping. He hesitated the way most men of his acquaintance would hesitate at such an offer. "No offense meant, ma'am," he said slowly, "but this is a legal matter, a serious one." "I understand entirely," Eleanor said, meeting his gaze without wavering. "I am not asking you to trust me blindly. I am asking you to let me look at the deed for 5 minutes. If I am wrong, you have lost nothing but the time it takes to say so." Something in her tone, the calm certainty of it, the absence of pleading, made Fenwick pause. He glanced at the younger man beside him, who shrugged as if to say, what harm could it do? "Very well," Fenwick said, finally reaching into his coat for a folded paper. 5 minutes. Eleanor took the deed to a small table near the window, spreading it flat, her eyes moving quickly across the surveyor's markings, the boundary descriptions, the dates and signatures. It took her less than 5 minutes to find it, a transposed number in the survey coordinates. A simple clerical error that had shifted the entire northern boundary line by nearly 40 acres on paper. Though the actual physical boundary, marked by an old stone wall still standing on the land itself, told a different story entirely. "Here," Eleanor said, pointing to the line in question. "Your surveyor recorded the distance as 312 rods when it should read 321. A simple transposition, but it moves your boundary considerably on paper. If you can produce a witness to the original stone wall, someone who remembers its placement from before this survey was recorded, you have grounds to correct the deed and defend your land." Fenwick stared at the page, then at Eleanor, his expression shifting slowly from skepticism to something like astonishment. "There's an old farmer 2 properties over," he said slowly. "Been on his land 60 years. He'd remember that wall." "Then I would suggest you visit him today," Eleanor said, "before Mr. Whitcomb's lawyers think to do the same." Fenwick folded the deed with hands that trembled slightly, whether from relief or lingering disbelief, Eleanor could not say. "Ma'am," he said, "I don't know who you are, but you may have just saved 20 years of my life's work." "My name is Eleanor Whitmore," she said, and found as she said it that leaving off the name Carter felt less like a loss than a return. Word of the incident spread through Richmond's small merchant circles faster than Eleanor anticipated. Within a week, she had been quietly consulted by 3 more families, a widow disputing an inheritance clause, a young couple confused by a mortgage agreement, an elderly tobacco farmer certain he was being cheated by his own factor. Each time, Eleanor approached the documents with the same patient, methodical attention she had once given to the Carter estate's endless correspondence. And each time, she found the small buried errors, the transposed numbers, the ambiguous clauses, the assumptions no one had thought to question. She began keeping a small ledger of her own, recording each case, each correction, each family whose land or livelihood she had helped secure. It was, she realized one evening, as she sat by candlelight reviewing her notes, the first ledger she had ever kept purely for herself, not for a husband's estate, not for a mother-in-law's approval, but for the quiet growing proof of her own worth. Margaret Ann watched this transformation with a mixture of pride and concern. "You're becoming something of a legend among the shopkeepers," she said one evening as they sat together over tea. "Mrs. Aldridge says her husband speaks of nothing else, the widow Carter. They're calling you, though you're no widow at all." "Let them call me what they like," Eleanor said. "It matters little so long as the work is sound." "Does it not concern you," Margaret Ann asked carefully, "what people will say once word reaches Nathaniel, a married woman working openly correcting the legal affairs of strangers?" Eleanor set down her teacup, considering the question with the same steadiness she brought to every deed she examined. "I spent 3 years being told that my mind had no place at my own dinner table," she said. "I will not now apologize for finding a table where it does." Margaret Ann said nothing more, though her eyes, when they met Eleanor's, held something like admiration. Nathaniel's search for his wife had in the first days been driven largely by pride, by the sting of a household disrupted of questions from neighbors he did not know how to answer, of his mother's growing insistence that the matter be settled quietly and quickly before it became a scandal. He rode to town, inquired at the inns, sent letters to acquaintances in the surrounding counties, and found nothing but silence, and the occasional pitying glance from men who had heard in whatever distorted form that Eleanor Carter had left her husband in the middle of the night. It was nearly 3 weeks before a piece of real information reached him, delivered unexpectedly by his own attorney, a cautious man named Whitlock, who handled the Carter family's legal affairs in Richmond. "There's talk in the city," Whitlock said carefully, seated across from Nathaniel in the study that had once been Eleanor's domain as much as his own, of a woman assisting local families with land disputes. Quite skilled by all accounts. Untangled a boundary error for Josiah Fenwick that saved him a considerable parcel of land. They call her Mrs. Whitmore. Nathaniel's hand tightened around his glass. "Whitmore," he repeated. "Eleanor's maiden name." "I make no assumptions," Whitlock said, "but given the timing and given what I understand of Mrs. Carter's, forgive me Mrs. Whitmore's particular skills, I thought you would wish to know." Nathaniel sat in silence for a long moment after his attorney left, staring at the ledgers still stacked on the study desk. Ledgers he had not touched in weeks. Not because he lacked the time, but because he lacked. He was beginning to admit to himself the competence. He had asked the estate steward to review the Eastern Field accounts the previous week, and had been quietly, uncomfortably informed that several entries made no sense without Mrs. Carter's private notations kept in a separate book no one else could locate. He thought of the dinner 3 weeks earlier, of his own voice light and careless, saying the words that had emptied his house of the one person who had in truth been holding it together. He thought of Eleanor's steady, unshaken voice. "I understand." He had believed in that moment that she meant she understood her place, the very thing he had implied she must accept. He understood now with a slow and unwelcome clarity that she had meant something else entirely. She had understood at last exactly what her husband thought of her, and she had acted on that understanding with more resolve than he had shown in the whole of their marriage. "Fetch my horse," he said to the servant waiting near the door. "I'm riding to Richmond." "Bad trunk." Margaret Carter did not learn of her son's departure until he was already 3 hours down the road, and when she did, her reaction was not concern for Eleanor's well-being, nor even curiosity about the woman's remarkable success in the city, but a sharp immediate irritation at what she perceived as her son's weakness. "You intend to go begging after a woman who abandoned her household in the night?" she said to the empty study, though there was no one present to hear her. "You intend to chase a woman who thought so little of her marriage that she vanished before sunrise, taking the family's private accounts with her." She had raised Nathaniel to understand from the earliest age that a wife's role was to enhance a household's standing, to be admired, to be gracious, to be seen, and rarely heard on matters of consequence. Eleanor had never quite fit that mold, and Margaret had spent 3 years quietly, persistently reminding her son of the gap between his wife and her expectations in comments so small and so frequent that neither Nathaniel nor Eleanor had ever named them for what they were. A slow campaign of diminishment, waged not with cruelty exactly, but with the casual, unthinking confidence of a woman who had never once questioned whether her own values were worth questioning. She did not yet understand that her son riding toward Richmond with something closer to desperation than pride in his chest had already begun to see the shape of that campaign clearly for the first time, and that seeing it would change more than his marriage. It would change him. Nathaniel reached Richmond as the afternoon light was beginning to soften into evening gold, the city's streets busy with merchants closing their shops and farmers loading the last of their wagons for the journey home. He had no address for his wife, only Whitlock's mention of the Fenwick family, and it took him the better part of an hour, asking careful questions of shopkeepers who eyed him with open curiosity before he found himself standing outside the dry goods store where Eleanor had first offered her help. Josiah Fenwick himself was behind the counter, and his expression upon learning who Nathaniel was shifted from polite welcome to something considerably cooler. "You'll be looking for your wife, then?" Fenwick said, not quite a question. "I am," Nathaniel said. "I understand she's been of some assistance to you." "She saved my land," Fenwick said flatly. 40 acres I'd have lost to a clerical error if not for her. Sharpest mind I've encountered on a deed in 20 years of business, and I include every lawyer in this city in that comparison. He paused, studying Nathaniel with an expression that made the younger man distinctly uncomfortable. Strange thing, a woman with a mind like that married to a man who let her walk out his door in the middle of the night. Nathaniel had no answer for that. He asked instead where he might find her in Fenwick. After a long moment of consideration, provided the address of Margaret Ann Pruitt's house, not out of any particular loyalty to Nathaniel, but because he suspected correctly that Eleanor was capable of handling whatever conversation followed without his interference. Eleanor was seated at the small writing desk in her cousin's parlor, reviewing the details of a new case. An elderly widow whose late husband's will had been contested by a distant nephew when she heard the knock at the front door, followed by Margaret Ann's voice tight with surprise, and then unmistakably Nathaniel's voice answering. She did not rise immediately. She finished the line she was writing, set down her pen, and only then walked to the parlor doorway, where she found her husband standing just inside the entrance, travel-worn, his usually immaculate coat dusty from the road, his expression a complicated mixture of relief and uncertainty that she had never before seen him wear. "Eleanor," he said. Nathaniel. Her voice was even without warmth, without anger. It was the voice of a woman greeting an acquaintance rather than a husband she had not seen in 3 weeks. "I've come to bring you home," he said, and then, seeming to hear how the words sounded, even as he spoke them, added quickly, "That is, I've come to ask you to come home, if you'll allow me to speak with you." Margaret Ann, sensing the moment required privacy, murmured something about checking on supper and withdrew toward the kitchen, leaving Eleanor and Nathaniel alone in the small parlor, the evening light slanting gold through the front window. "You may speak," Eleanor said, "though I make no promise of what I'll say in return." Nathaniel drew a breath, and for the first time in their marriage, Eleanor watched him search for words the way she herself had so often been forced to search carefully, uncertainly, without the easy confidence he usually wore like his tailored coats. "I've spoken to Josiah Fenwick," he said, "and Whitlock tells me there are others. Widows, farmers, people with no one else to turn to, and you gave them what they needed." He paused. "I didn't know you were capable of that." "You never asked," Eleanor said simply. "No," Nathaniel admitted. "I didn't. For 3 years, Nathaniel, I managed the accounts that kept your estate from ruin. I corrected the errors your steward was too careless to catch. I wrote the letters that kept your creditors patient when your own words would have lost their patience entirely. I did this quietly because I believed that was what a good wife did, support her husband without asking for acknowledgement." Her voice remained level, but something beneath it had hardened like iron cooling into its final shape. "And at my own table in front of 40 guests you called me undecorative, as though the only value I could possibly hold was in how prettily I sat beside you." "I didn't mean," Nathaniel began. "I know you didn't mean it as cruelty," Eleanor said, cutting him off not unkindly, but firmly. "That is in some ways worse. You didn't mean it as cruelty because you had never once considered that I might be more than decoration. It wasn't malice, Nathaniel. It was simply that you had never looked closely enough to know better. Nathaniel was silent for a long moment. Outside, the sound of a passing cart rattled faintly down the street, and somewhere in the house, Margaret Ann's footsteps moved quietly through the kitchen, granting them what privacy she could. "You're right," Nathaniel said finally, and the admission seemed to cost him something, his voice rougher than she had ever heard it. "I never looked closely. Not at the ledgers. Not at the letters. Not at you. I looked at what my mother taught me to look for in a wife: grace, composure. A certain kind of beauty that reflects well on a man's household, and I never once asked what else might be there beneath it." "And now," Eleanor asked, "now I've spent 3 weeks discovering that I cannot manage my own estate without you," he said. "That the accounts make no sense. That half of what I believed I understood about my own land, I understood only because you explained it to me in ways I never thanked you for. I came here prepared to ask you to come home because the house needs you." He paused, and something in his expression shifted, softened, became less certain and more honest. "But standing here now, I find that isn't the whole truth. I've missed you, Eleanor. Not the version of you that manages my accounts. You. Your voice at breakfast. Your questions I never had good answers for. I didn't understand what I had until the house went quiet." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, searching his face for the particular kind of performance she had grown accustomed to over 3 years of marriage. The charm he wore like a second coat. The words designed to smooth over discomfort rather than address it honestly. She did not find it. What she found instead was something rawer, less practiced. A man genuinely unsettled by what he had discovered about himself. It was not enough. Not yet. "I will not return to a house where I must disappear to make others comfortable," she said. "Not for you, not for your mother, not for the sake of appearances at your dinner table." "Then tell me what you require," Nathaniel said. "I mean it, Eleanor. Tell me, and I will find a way to give it." Eleanor considered him for a long moment, the summer evening light catching the gray of her eyes steady and unflinching. "I require the right to manage the estate's accounts openly, not in secret, with full acknowledgement before your family and your peers of the work I do. I require the right to speak my opinion at your table without fear of ridicule, and I require," she said, her voice quieter now, but no less firm, "an apology spoken as plainly and as publicly as the insult was given. Not to satisfy my pride, Nathaniel, but because your mother and your guests must understand, as clearly as they understood your cruelty, that it was wrong." Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "I will do it," he said. "Whatever it costs me with my mother, I will do it." "Then we have something to discuss," Eleanor said. "But understand this, Nathaniel, I am not returning as the wife who left. I am returning as the woman who discovered in your absence precisely what she is capable of. If you cannot make room for that woman in your house, then there is no house I wish to return to." "I understand," Nathaniel said, and this time when he spoke those words, Eleanor heard in them none of the careless dismissal that had colored his voice 3 weeks earlier at that long candlelit table. She heard instead something that might with time and honest effort become respect. She did not answer him immediately. She turned instead toward the window where the last light of the Virginia summer evening was fading gold over the rooftops of Richmond, and said nothing more that evening, leaving Nathaniel to sit with the weight of everything she had asked of him, and everything he still had left to prove. Nathaniel did not sleep that night. He took a room at a modest inn near the center of Richmond, the kind of place he would never have considered before, with thin walls and a lumpy mattress, and the sound of carriage wheels rattling past until well past midnight. And he lay awake, turning over every word Eleanor had spoken to him in that parlor. "I am returning as the woman who discovered precisely what she is capable of." The sentence would not leave him. It sat in his chest like a stone, heavy and immovable, forcing him to confront a version of his marriage he had spent 3 years refusing to see clearly. He rose before dawn, dressed without calling for assistance he did not have in that borrowed room, and walked the quiet streets of Richmond as the sky lightened from black to gray to the soft gold of early morning. He passed the dry goods store, where Fenwick would soon open his shutters. He passed the courthouse, where he now understood his wife had quietly become something of a fixture among clerks and lawyers who could not solve the problems she solved with ease. He found himself standing outside Margaret Ann Pruitt's brick house, long before a decent hour for calling, and he made himself wait, pacing the street, rehearsing words that felt inadequate, no matter how he arranged them. When Margaret Ann finally opened the door at his knock, she studied him for a long moment before speaking. "You're up early, Mr. Carter." "I couldn't sleep," Nathaniel admitted. "No," she said. "I don't imagine you could." She stepped back to let him in, though her expression remained guarded. "Eleanor is at the courthouse already. She keeps early hours these days, earlier than she ever did in your house from what she's told me." The comment landed exactly as she intended it to. Nathaniel absorbed it without argument. "I'll wait if I may," he said. Margaret Ann considered him a moment longer, then gestured toward the small parlor. "You may wait. But understand, Mr. Carter, that I have watched my cousin arrive at my door in the middle of the night with a trunk and no husband beside her, and I have watched her build something real for herself in these 3 weeks. Whatever you intend to say to her, I hope you intend to mean it. She has had enough of men who speak beautifully and act carelessly." "I intend to mean it," Nathaniel said quietly. "I only hope I'm capable of proving that." Yay. Eleanor returned a little past 10 that morning, her arms full of papers, her bonnet slightly askew from the summer wind, and she stopped short in the parlor doorway at the sight of Nathaniel rising from the chair where he had waited nearly 2 hours. "You're still here," she said. "I told you I would find a way to give you what you asked for," Nathaniel said. "I intend to start proving that today if you'll permit me." Eleanor set her papers down carefully on the side table, buying herself a moment to consider him. There was something different in his posture this morning, less of the practiced ease he wore like his tailored coats, more of the uncertain searching quality she had glimpsed the evening before. "Proving it how?" she asked. "I've sent word to my mother," Nathaniel said. "I've told her I intend to hold a dinner at the estate within the fortnight, the same guests who were present the night I insulted you. I intend to make my apology there in the same room before the same people who witnessed the insult." Eleanor's expression did not soften immediately, though something in her eyes sharpened with interest. "You told your mother this?" "I did." "And how did she respond?" Nathaniel's jaw tightened slightly. "She responded as I expected. She called it unnecessary. She said a private word between us would suffice, that airing family matters before guests was beneath the family's dignity." "And what did you tell her?" "I told her that a public insult requires a public correction," Nathaniel said. "I told her that if she could not accept, that she was welcome to take her meals in her own chambers on the evening in question." Eleanor's eyebrows lifted slightly. This at least was new. In 3 years of marriage, she had never once heard Nathaniel speak to his mother with anything but deference, however quietly resentful he might have felt beneath it. "You said that to her?" Eleanor repeated, testing the words. "I did," Nathaniel said. "And I meant it. Eleanor, I've spent 3 weeks reading the ledgers you kept trying to understand, accounts that made perfect sense to you and no sense to me at all. I've spent 3 weeks explaining to my own steward why the Eastern field rotations matter, using arguments I only understood because I finally sat down and studied your notes properly for the first time. I've spent 3 weeks discovering exactly how much of my life you built quietly, while I took the credit for a smoothly running household and never once asked how it ran so smoothly." He paused, and his voice when it continued was rougher. "I am not the same man who sat at that table 3 weeks ago. I don't expect you to believe that after one conversation. But I intend to show you however long it takes." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, her gaze moving over his face as though searching for the seams where performance might show through sincerity. She had learned over 3 years to distrust Nathaniel's charm precisely because it came so easily to him, smoothing over every discomfort before it could take root. What she saw now was different, awkward in places, uncertain, a man clearly unaccustomed to admitting fault and finding the process more difficult than he had anticipated. "I will consider your dinner," she said finally. But I will not simply appear at your table as though these 3 weeks never happened, Nathaniel. If I return to that house even for one evening, it will be on my terms. I will speak if I choose to speak. I will not smile simply to smooth over anyone's discomfort, including my own." "Agreed," Nathaniel said without hesitation. "And I want it understood before your mother and your guests precisely what work I have done these past weeks. Not vaguely, not softened for comfort. I want Josiah Fenwick's case spoken of plainly, and the others besides." Nathaniel hesitated only a moment. "Agreed," he said again. Eleanor studied him a moment longer, then gave a single measured nod. "Then I will come to your dinner," she said. "But understand, Nathaniel, one dinner does not restore a marriage. It is a beginning, nothing more. What happens after will depend entirely on what I see in that room." The 2 weeks that followed passed differently than either of them expected. Nathaniel did not return immediately to the estate, as Eleanor had assumed he would. Instead, he took a room near Margaret Ann's house and remained in Richmond, appearing each morning at the courthouse steps or the small office Eleanor had begun renting above Fenwick's shop, watching at first from a careful distance the work his wife had built in his absence. "You're following me," Eleanor said on the third such morning, finding him seated on a bench across the street from her office as she arrived. "I'm learning," Nathaniel said. "You once told me I never asked. I'm asking now." By watching silently from a bench, it seemed less presumptuous than demanding entry, Nathaniel said, and there was the faintest hint of dry humor in his voice, the first Eleanor had heard from him since his arrival in the city. "Though if you'd permit me to observe more closely, I would consider it a kindness." Eleanor considered him for a long moment, weighing the request against 3 years of accumulated caution. Then, without fully understanding her own decision, she gestured toward the office door. "5 minutes," she said. "You may watch. You may not speak unless spoken to." It was in its own small way a mirror of the conditions Fenwick had once set for her, and something in the symmetry was not lost on either of them. Inside, Eleanor was meeting with a widow named Constance Abernathy, a small anxious woman in her 50s, whose late husband's estate had been contested by a nephew claiming an earlier unrecorded will. Nathaniel sat quietly near the window as Eleanor worked through the documents, her questions precise, her manner patient but unwavering, drawing out details. The widow had not thought relevant dates, witnesses, the location of a strongbox that might contain the true final will. "You believe your husband amended his will after the nephew's visit last spring," Eleanor said, tapping the paper before her. "You mentioned he was upset by that visit. Do you recall if he spoke to anyone about it afterward? A lawyer? A clerk? Anyone at all?" "He mentioned Mr. Halloway," the widow said slowly. "The lawyer in King William County. But that was months before he passed, and I never thought—" "It's worth inquiring," Eleanor said. "A man who feels wronged by a relative often takes action quietly without announcing it to the household. If your husband amended his will after that visit, Mr. Halloway would have record of it." The widow's hands, which had been twisting anxiously in her lap throughout the meeting, went suddenly still. "You think there might be a later will?" "I think it's possible," Eleanor said carefully. "I make no promises. But it's worth the journey to King William County before you accept your nephew's claim as final." When the widow had gone tearful but hopeful, clutching a letter of introduction Eleanor had written for her to carry to the lawyer in question, Nathaniel remained seated by the window for a long moment, saying nothing. "You have a question," Eleanor observed, gathering her papers. "I have several," Nathaniel said. "But the one I keep returning to is this: how many times in 3 years did I watch you sit at your writing desk in the evenings, assuming you were occupied with correspondence when you were doing precisely this?" "More times than I could count," Eleanor said simply. "And I never asked what you were working on." "No," Eleanor said. "You didn't. You." Nathaniel was quiet a moment, absorbing this without argument, and Eleanor found to her own surprise that his silence, his willingness to sit with the discomfort of the truth, rather than smooth it over with charm, struck her as more meaningful than anything he might have said. By the second week, Nathaniel had begun making himself useful in small, practical ways, not by inserting himself into Eleanor's work, which she made clear she would not permit, but by attending to matters he had long neglected at the estate. He wrote to his steward with detailed instructions, drawn from Eleanor's own notations, correcting errors in the eastern field rotation that had gone unaddressed for months. He met twice with Whitlock to review the estate's finances properly for the first time in his adult life, sitting through an entire accounting session without excusing himself early out of boredom or discomfort. And he had, though he mentioned it to no one but Eleanor, begun the more difficult work of confronting his mother. "She refuses to apologize," he told Eleanor one evening. The two of them seated at a small table in a modest tavern near the edge of the city, a meeting Eleanor had agreed to only after significant hesitation. "I've asked her directly. I've told her that her comment about ledgers and lace was as cruel as anything I said, and that she owes you an apology equal to mine." "And what did she say?" "She said," Nathaniel repeated, his jaw tight, "that she raised me to marry well, and that a wife who spends her days in courthouses correcting deeds for strangers is not what she had in mind for the Carter name." Eleanor's expression did not change, though something in her eyes hardened slightly. "And how did you respond to that?" "I told her," Nathaniel said, "that the Carter name would have lost 40 acres to Whitcomb's lawyers years ago if not for a woman with exactly that kind of mind, and that I would rather my name be associated with competence than with cruelty." Eleanor set down her cup slowly. "You said that to your mother?" "I did." "And what did she say to that?" Nathaniel's mouth twisted into something that was not quite a smile. "She left the room. It's the closest thing to a retreat I've ever witnessed from her." Eleanor felt, despite herself, the faint stirring of something that might have been respect, not yet trust, not yet warmth, but a grudging acknowledgement that the man across the table from her was in fact attempting the difficult work he had promised. "It isn't enough," she said carefully. "One conversation with your mother does not undo 3 years." "I know that," Nathaniel said. "I'm not asking you to believe it's enough. I'm only asking you to notice that I'm trying." The dinner, when it finally arrived, took place on a warm evening in late July. The same long table set once more with crystal and candlelight. The same 40 guests, or nearly the same. Eleanor noted, scanning the room as she entered on Nathaniel's arm, gathered once more in the Carter dining hall. She had chosen her dress carefully that evening. Not the elaborate silk she might once have worn to please Margaret Carter's sense of propriety, but a simple, well-made gown of deep blue that suited her, without ornamentation, a small but deliberate statement she made to herself before she ever made it to anyone else. Conversation quieted noticeably as she entered. She could feel the weight of 40 pairs of eyes settling on her, curious, some sympathetic, others openly skeptical. All of them clearly aware that something unusual was about to unfold at this table. Margaret Carter sat at Nathaniel's right hand, as she always had, her expression composed into careful neutrality, though Eleanor did not miss the tightness around her mouth. Nathaniel waited until the first course had been served, until the low hum of forced conversation had settled into something approaching normalcy, before he rose from his chair, his wine glass in hand, exactly as he had 3 weeks earlier at this same table. The room quieted again, guests glancing toward each other with the particular alertness of people who sensed a repeat of a scene they had witnessed once already and did not wish to witness again. 3 weeks ago. Nathaniel began, his voice steady, despite the visible tension in his shoulders. "I stood at this table and made a remark about my wife that I have regretted every day since. I called her undecorative, as though her worth to this family, to this estate, and to me, could be measured by nothing more than how prettily she sat beside me at dinner." A murmur moved through the guests. Colonel Whitfield, seated near the far end, set down his fork, his weathered face unreadable. "What I did not say that evening," Nathaniel continued, "and what I should have said long before that evening ever arrived, is this. My wife has for 3 years managed the accounts of this estate with a precision I have never once matched myself. She corrected errors in our Eastern field records that would have cost this family nearly $400 had they gone unaddressed. She wrote the letters that kept our creditors patient during years when my own correspondents would have lost their goodwill entirely. And in the 3 weeks since I insulted her at this table, she has used that same mind to save a local farmer's land from an unjust claim to help a widow secure her rightful inheritance and to earn the respect of half the merchants and lawyers in Richmond. He turned for the first time to look directly at Eleanor, who sat straight-backed and watchful, her gray-blue eyes fixed on his face with an intensity that made him falter for only a moment before continuing. "I was wrong," he said, and his voice, though quiet, carried clearly through the silent room. "I was wrong to call her undecorative. I was wrong to have never once in 3 years asked her what she thought, what she wanted, what she was capable of. I ask her forgiveness tonight, not because I expect it freely given, but because she deserves to hear before the same people who witnessed my cruelty exactly how wrong I was." The silence that followed stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. Margaret Carter's hands were folded tightly in her lap, her expression rigid. Several guests exchanged uncertain glances, unsure whether the moment called for applause for silence, or for some third response none of them had been prepared to offer. It was Colonel Whitfield unexpectedly who broke the silence. "Well?" he said, his gravelly voice carrying down the length of the table. "I've known men in this county who wouldn't admit a mistake at gunpoint. Carter's just done it in front of 40 witnesses. Strikes me that deserves at least a moment's respect whatever else is said tonight." A ripple of quiet agreement moved through the room, not enthusiastic, but present a shift in the air that Eleanor felt as clearly as a change in weather. She rose from her seat, and the room's attention turned to her at once. "I accept your apology, Nathaniel," she said, her voice steady and clear. "Not because it undoes 3 years of feeling unseen in my own home, but because I believe you meant it, and because I have watched you these past weeks do the harder work of proving it beyond words alone." She paused, letting her gaze move deliberately down the table, resting for a moment on Margaret Carter's tight, unreadable expression. "I will also say this before this table, because I believe it deserves to be said as plainly as the insult that began this. A woman's worth is not decorative. It is not measured by how gracefully she fills a chair beside her husband, or how little she troubles a room with her opinions. My worth, whatever else may be said of me in this county, lies in what I am capable of building with my mind, with my labor, with my own 2 hands. I will not apologize for that again to anyone at any table." The applause when it came was not universal. Several older guests remained stiffly silent, unwilling to endorse a sentiment that unsettled their understanding of a woman's proper place. But it was real, scattered but genuine, led first by Colonel Whitfield, and followed to Eleanor's quiet surprise by young Mrs. Ashford, who caught her eye across the table with an expression of open admiration. Margaret Carter did not applaud. She sat rigid, her jaw tight, her eyes fixed on some point beyond the table, and when the meal resumed, she said almost nothing. For the remainder of the evening, though Eleanor noticed more than once the older woman's gaze drifting toward her, with an expression that was not quite hostility and not quite respect, something unresolved, sitting uneasily between the two. It was near the end of the evening as guests began to depart, and carriages rattled once more down the long gravel drive that Margaret finally approached Eleanor, directly catching her alone near the entrance hall, while Nathaniel bid farewell to the last of the guests. "You've made quite a scene of yourself tonight." Margaret said, her voice low and controlled. "I answered a public insult with a public truth," Eleanor said evenly. "I made no scene that wasn't already set in motion 3 weeks ago at this same table by your son and by your own comment about ledgers and lace." Margaret's expression flickered something like surprise passing briefly across her composed features. She had not expected, it seemed, for Eleanor to name her own contribution to that evening so plainly. "You think this changes anything," Margaret said. "You think one apology dressed up as a speech before 40 guests undoes what you are." "I think," Eleanor said, "that what I am was never in question. I think what has changed is that your son finally understands it, and I intend to see whether that understanding holds now that the audience has gone home." Margaret studied her for a long moment, and for the first time in 3 years, Eleanor saw something shift behind the older woman's carefully guarded eyes. Not warmth, not yet, but a grudging recalculation, the look of a woman forced to reconsider an assumption she had held without question for decades. "He's never spoken to me the way he has these past 2 weeks," Margaret said finally, her voice quieter than Eleanor had ever heard it. never once challenged me. I raised him to respect his elders, to value his family's standing above his own comfort. I did not raise him to argue with his own mother over the placement of a woman at a dinner table. Perhaps, Eleanor said carefully, you raised him to value the wrong things. Margaret's mouth tightened, but she did not respond immediately. She turned instead, drawing her shawl more closely around her shoulders, and walked toward the stairs without another word, leaving Eleanor standing alone in the entrance hall, uncertain whether she had won a small victory or merely opened a longer, more difficult war. Nathaniel found her there a few minutes later. The last of the guests finally gone, the house settling into the particular quiet that follows a large gathering. "You spoke to my mother," he said. "Briefly," Eleanor said. "She is not yet convinced of anything, Nathaniel. Least of all that she was wrong." "No," Nathaniel agreed. "I don't imagine she will be, not easily. But she heard tonight in front of the whole county exactly what I think of the woman she raised me to dismiss. That matters, even if she won't admit it matters." Eleanor considered this, weighing it against everything she had witnessed in 3 years of watching Margaret Carter shape her son's understanding of what a wife should be. "It's a beginning," she allowed. "Nothing more." "I understand that," Nathaniel said. "I told you before I don't expect this to be resolved in one evening. I only hope you'll allow me the chance to keep proving it evening after evening for as long as it takes." Eleanor studied him for a long moment in the quiet hall, the candlelight catching the earnest uncertainty in his expression, so different from the easy confidence he had once worn without thought. "I will return to Richmond tomorrow," she said finally. "I have obligations there now. Constance Abernathy's case is not yet settled, and there are 2 others waiting on my attention. I will not abandon that work, Nathaniel, not for you, not for this house, not for anyone." "I wouldn't ask you to," Nathaniel said, and something in his voice told her he meant it. "I only ask that you allow me to visit, to see the work you're doing, to learn properly this time what I should have asked to learn years ago." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, and then for the first time since she had packed her father's ledgers into a wooden trunk and walked out into the dark. Before dawn, she allowed herself something that was not quite a smile, but was perhaps its earliest beginning. "You may visit," she said. "But understand, Nathaniel, I return to Richmond as Eleanor Whitmore, not as your wife waiting to be summoned home. Whatever this becomes, it will be built on those terms, or it will not be built at all." "Understood," Nathaniel said quietly. "I wouldn't want it any other way." She turned toward the door, prepared to call for the cart that would carry her back toward the city, before the night grew too late, when Sarah, the young housemaid, appeared suddenly in the hallway, her face pale, her breath quick with urgency. "Mr. Carter," Sarah said. "There's a rider just come from town. He says it's urgent, something about the Whitcomb boundary dispute and Mr. Fenwick's land." Nathaniel and Eleanor exchanged a sharp glance. "Whitcomb," Eleanor repeated. "Fenwick's case was settled. I saw the corrected deed filed myself not 2 weeks past. The rider says Whitcomb's lawyers have filed a new claim." Sarah said, her voice trembling slightly with the weight of delivering unwelcome news. "Says they've found some other survey, an older one, that contradicts the wall boundary Mr. Fenwick's witness testified to. Says if the court accepts it, Fenwick loses the land after all, and worse." She hesitated, glancing between them. "The rider says, Whitcomb's lawyer is claiming the correction you made, Mrs. Carter, was itself fraudulent, that you altered figures to favor Mr. Fenwick unlawfully." The words landed in the quiet hallway like a stone dropped into still water, spreading outward in silence. Eleanor felt something cold settle in her chest, a feeling she recognized from years of careful, unglamorous work, the particular dread of watching a fragile structure threaten to collapse under weight she had not anticipated. "That's not possible," she said quietly. "I examined that deed myself. The transposition was clear. The stone wall witness corroborated the original boundary." "I don't doubt you." Nathaniel said, his voice suddenly sharp with an urgency she had not heard from him before. "But if Whitcomb's lawyers are prepared to accuse you of fraud before the court, this is no longer a simple boundary dispute. This is an attack on your name, and on every case you've built since. Eleanor's mind was already moving quickly, sorting through the implications with the same swift precision she brought to every deed. If Whitcomb succeeded in discrediting her work on Fenwick's case, every family she had helped, the widow Abernathy, the young couple with their mortgage confusion, all of them would find their corrected documents suddenly suspect, their newfound security dissolved by a single accusation of fraud leveled against the woman who had helped them. "I need to return to Richmond tonight," she said. "Not tomorrow. Tonight." "I'll come with you," Nathaniel said immediately. Eleanor turned to him, startled by the speed of his offer. "This isn't your fight, Nathaniel. It became my fight," Nathaniel said, "the moment I stood at that table tonight and told 40 guests that your work deserved respect. If Whitcomb's lawyers succeed in calling that work fraudulent, they make a liar of everything I said an hour ago. I won't sit here and let that happen while you fight it alone." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, searching once more for the seams of performance, and found instead something that looked unmistakably like resolve. "Then fetch the carriage," she said. "We ride within the hour." The night outside had turned close and warm, the air thick with the promise of a summer storm gathering somewhere beyond the dark tree line, and as the carriage rattled down the long gravel drive away from the Carter estate, Eleanor sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, her mind already racing ahead to the papers she would need, the witnesses she would have to re-examine, the accusation she would have to answer before it could destroy everything she had built in the weeks since she had walked away from a table where she had been called undecorative. She did not yet know how deep Whitcomb's claim would reach, or who among Richmond's quiet circle of lawyers and clerks had helped manufacture it. She knew only that the fragile, hard-won respect she had built for herself, the first respect she had ever earned entirely on her own terms, now stood on the edge of collapse, and that the man beside her, the same man who had once called her undecorative before 40 witnesses, was for the first time in their marriage prepared to stand beside her rather than watch from a comfortable distance while she fought alone. The carriage reached Richmond well past midnight. The horses lathered from the hard pace Nathaniel had set, and Eleanor was out of the door before the wheels had fully stopped. Her skirts gathered in one hand, her mind already fixed on the papers waiting in her small office above Fenwick's shop. "Eleanor, wait. There's no time to wait, Nathaniel." She was already moving toward the stairs, her voice sharp with a focus he had never seen in her before, not even the night she had corrected his ledgers by candlelight. "If Whitcomb's lawyers file that claim with the circuit court in the morning, the accusation becomes part of the public record before I've had a chance to answer it. Every family who trusted me will read it in the same breath as Fenwick's name." She unlocked the office door with hands that were not quite steady, and Nathaniel followed her inside, watching as she lit the lamp with quick, practiced movements and began pulling files from the cabinet against the wall, her eyes scanning dates and names with an intensity that made him feel, not for the first time that night, entirely useless. "Tell me what to do," he said. "I'm not leaving you to fight this alone." Eleanor did not look up from the papers spread across her desk. "Then find Josiah Fenwick. Wake him if you must. I need to know exactly what his lawyer has told him, and I need the name of whoever Whitcomb has retained. If I know who's building this case against me, I can begin to understand how." Nathaniel hesitated only a moment before nodding and disappearing back down the stairs into the dark street, and Eleanor was alone with her files, her lamp, and the cold, familiar dread of a woman who understood, with painful clarity, exactly how quickly a reputation built on trust could be dismantled by a single accusation loud enough to be believed. Fenwick answered his door in his nightshirt, a candle in one hand, his expression shifting from irritation to alarm the moment he recognized Nathaniel standing on his step. "Mr. Carter, it's near 1 in the morning." "I know," Nathaniel said. "I need to know what you've heard about the new claim against your land, and I need the name of Whitcomb's lawyer." Fenwick's jaw tightened. "Come in then. No sense shouting it into the street." Inside, by the light of a single candle, Fenwick laid out what he knew, his voice low and tight, with barely restrained anger. "A writer came from the courthouse clerk's office this evening. A man I trust told me Whitcomb's lawyer fellow named Prescott Hale filed papers claiming an earlier survey exists. One that predates the wall boundary my old neighbor testified to. Says the new survey shows the northern acres always belonged inside Whitcomb's line. "Where did this survey come from?" Nathaniel asked. Eleanor examined every document connected to that deed. There was no earlier survey in the county records. "That's precisely the trouble," Fenwick said grimly. "Hale claims it was never filed properly, says it was drawn up nearly 30 years back by a surveyor who's long since dead and kept private in Whitcomb's family papers all this time. Convenient, wouldn't you say, that it surfaces now, the very week your wife's correction threatens to cost the man 40 acres. Nathaniel felt something cold and furious settle into his chest. "You believe it's fabricated. I believe," Fenwick said, "that a man who stands to lose good land doesn't wait 30 years to produce the one document that would save it unless he needed time to have it made convincing." He paused, his weathered face creasing with something like guilt. "And I'll tell you plainly, Mr. Carter Hale isn't stopping at the boundary claim. He's told half the courthouse that your wife altered the original survey figures herself to manufacture the very error she claimed to correct. Says a woman meddling in men's legal business ought to be examined closely, and he intends to see that she is." Nathaniel's hands curled into fists at his sides. "That's a lie." "I know it's a lie," Fenwick said, "but knowing it and proving it before a circuit judge are two different matters entirely. And there's talk, Mr. Carter, ugly talk, the kind that spreads faster than truth ever does, questioning why a married woman is conducting legal business alone in this city to begin with. Some are saying it reflects poorly on you that you can't keep your own wife in her proper place. Others are saying worse. Let them say what they like about me," Nathaniel said. "It's Eleanor's name they're trying to destroy, and I won't stand by while they do it." By the time Nathaniel returned to the office above the shop, the eastern sky had begun its first faint lightening toward gray, and he found Eleanor exactly where he had left her. Though the desk before her was now buried beneath a spreading map of documents, her ledger open, her handwriting filling page after page in quick, urgent strokes. "Prescott Hale," Nathaniel said, and watched Eleanor's head snap up at the name. "Hale," she repeated. "I know that name. He handled a land dispute for the Ashfords 2 years past, botched the paperwork so badly the family nearly lost their claim before another lawyer corrected it." She sat back slightly, something calculating entering her expression even through the exhaustion. A man who makes his living on sloppy work has every reason to resent a woman who catches sloppy work for a living. "Fenwick says Hale's produced an older survey," Nathaniel said. "One never filed with the county, supposedly drawn up 30 years ago and kept privately by Whitcomb's family." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, and then slowly a different kind of focus entered her eyes. Not panic, but the sharp, hungry attention of a woman who had just been handed the shape of a puzzle. "If such a survey truly exists and was never filed," she said carefully, "then it has no legal standing regardless of its accuracy. County law requires a survey to be recorded within a reasonable period to establish a boundary claim. 30 years of silence conveniently broken only now would itself be grounds for the court to view it with suspicion." "Then we have a defense," Nathaniel said. "We have the beginning of one," Eleanor said. "But Hale isn't foolish enough to rely on the survey alone. If he's accusing me of fraud, he intends to make the fight personal rather than legal, because a personal accusation against a woman working outside her expected place will find sympathy in this county far more easily than a technical argument about filing deadlines." She rubbed her eyes, the exhaustion of the past hours finally showing through her composure. "He doesn't need to win the case, Nathaniel. He only needs to convince enough of the county that a woman meddling in legal matters cannot be trusted, and every piece of work I've done since I arrived in this city collapses under that suspicion, whether the boundary itself is ever settled or not." Nathaniel sat down heavily in the chair across from her, the full shape of the danger settling over him for the first time. "Then what do we do?" Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, and something in her expression shifted, not warmth exactly, but a kind of grudging recognition of the word he had used. We find the original surveyor's records," she said. "If Hale's document was truly drawn 30 years ago, there should be some trace of the surveyor himself in the county archives' apprenticeship records. Other surveys he filed properly during that same period, something that establishes whether the man was known for careful work or careless work. If we can show a pattern of error in his other surveys, We cast doubt on this one, without ever needing to prove Whitcomb forged it outright. And if there's no trace of him at all, then we ask a more dangerous question, Eleanor said quietly. We ask whether the surveyor existed at all, or whether Whitcomb's family invented a name to attach to a document drawn up far more recently than 30 years ago. The courthouse archives opened at 7, and Eleanor was waiting on the steps before the clerk had even unlocked the door, Nathaniel beside her, both of them running on no sleep, and a shared unspoken determination that had sometime in the last few hours settled into something that felt less like obligation and more like partnership. The clerk, a thin, nervous young man named Pettibone, recognized Eleanor immediately and greeted her with visible discomfort. "Mrs. Carter, I've heard talk this morning about the Fenwick matter." "I imagine you have," Eleanor said evenly. "I need access to the surveyor apprenticeship records from 30 years past. A man named—" She glanced at the notes Fenwick had provided the night before. Ezra Thorne, supposedly employed by the Whitcomb family. Pettibone's discomfort deepened visibly. "Mrs. Carter, I don't know that I'm at liberty to assist you given the accusations Mr. Hale has." "Mr. Pettibone." Nathaniel interrupted his voice, carrying the particular authority of a man whose family had held land in this county for 3 generations. "These are public county records, and my wife has every right to examine them, as does any citizen with legitimate business before this court. If you refuse her access without cause, I will be certain the presiding judge hears of it directly." Pettibone paled, glanced between them, and finally reluctantly gestured them toward the archive room in the back. It took nearly 2 hours of searching through dust-thick ledgers and yellowed apprenticeship rolls before Eleanor found what she was looking for. Her finger tracing down a column of names in a book so old its binding had begun to crumble at the edges. "Here," she said, her voice sharpening with sudden triumph. "Ezra Thorne, apprenticed under a surveyor named Caldwell in 1789. But look, Nathaniel here in the same year is a formal complaint filed against him. 2 separate landowners accused Thorne of inaccurate measurements on properties adjoining their own. The county fined him. His license to practice independently was revoked only 4 years into his apprenticeship." Nathaniel leaned over her shoulder, reading the faded ink. "A surveyor known for sloppy, disputed work. A surveyor known for sloppy, disputed work," Eleanor confirmed, "whose supposed 30-year-old survey conveniently surfaces the very week it would cost Josiah Fenwick his land, and conveniently favors the very family who happens to still hold his original discredited papers." She sat back, something fierce and satisfied entering her expression for the first time since the accusation had first reached them. "This isn't proof of fraud, not yet. But it's more than enough doubt to bring before a judge, and enough to begin unraveling whatever confidence Hale hoped this survey would inspire." "Then we bring it to the court," Nathaniel said. "We bring it to the court," Eleanor agreed. "But there's more we need first. If Hale intends to accuse me of fraud directly, I need more than doubt about his survey. I need proof of exactly what I did and did not alter in Fenwick's original deed." It was nearly noon when they emerged from the archive room, and word had clearly spread through the courthouse in their absence, clerks glancing up from their desks with open curiosity. A small cluster of men near the entrance falling silent as Eleanor and Nathaniel passed, then resuming their conversation in lowered, deliberate tones the moment the pair had gone by. Eleanor kept her chin lifted and her pace, even though Nathaniel could see the tension in the set of her shoulders. The careful control she was exercising over an anger he suspected ran far deeper than she allowed herself to show. "They're already talking," she said quietly, once they had passed beyond earshot. "Let them talk," Nathaniel said. "Talk isn't evidence. Talk becomes evidence in a place like this, Nathaniel, when it's repeated by enough respectable mouths." Her voice was tight. "A woman's reputation is a fragile thing in this county. It takes years to build and an afternoon to destroy, and Hale knows that better than most, which is precisely why he's chosen this weapon, rather than a purely legal one." They had nearly reached the courthouse steps when a voice called out behind them, sharp and confident, carrying easily across the open square. "Mrs. Carter, a moment if you please." Eleanor turned to find a tall, narrow-faced man approaching, dressed in an expensive dark coat, his expression carrying the particular smugness of a man who believed he had already won whatever contest was about to unfold. "Mr. Hale, I presume," Eleanor said, her voice giving away nothing. "You presume correctly," Hale said, stopping a few feet away, his eyes moving over her with an appraising coldness that made Nathaniel's jaw tighten beside her. "I understand you've been quite busy in the archive room this morning. Digging for something, I imagine, though I confess, I'm curious what you expect to find." "I expect to find," Eleanor said evenly, "that Ezra Thorne's 30-year-old survey is precisely as unreliable as his county record suggests, and that a document surfacing so conveniently in the same week as my correction deserves rather more scrutiny than your client seems eager to invite." Something flickered across Hale's face, brief but unmistakable. A crack in his confidence he recovered from quickly. "Careful, Mrs. Carter. Accusations of impropriety cut in more than one direction. I intend to file formal charges questioning the legitimacy of your correction to the Fenwick deed by week's end. A woman with no legal training altering county records on nothing more than her own judgment, the court may take a rather dim view of that, regardless of whether your arithmetic happens to be correct." "My arithmetic," Eleanor said, "is not a matter of opinion, Mr. Hale. It is a matter of verifiable fact corroborated by a living witness who remembers the original boundary wall with his own eyes. Your client's survey, by contrast, comes from a man whose license was revoked for inaccurate work and who has been dead, if I understand correctly, for the better part of a decade, conveniently unavailable to answer for the document now attached to his name." Hale's composure slipped further, his eyes narrowing. "You'd do well to remember your place, Mrs. Carter, before you find yourself facing consequences your husband may not be able to smooth over so easily." "That sounds remarkably like a threat, Mr. Hale," Nathaniel said, stepping forward, his voice low and dangerous in a way Eleanor had never heard from him before. "It's merely an observation, Mr. Carter," Hale said, though he took an involuntary half-step back. "Good day to you both. I imagine we'll see each other again before the judge." He turned and walked away across the square, his pace brisk, and Eleanor watched him go with an expression that had hardened into something cold and unshakable. "He's frightened," she said quietly once Hale was out of earshot. "He didn't sound frightened," Nathaniel said. "He didn't need to sound it," Eleanor said. "But a man confident in his evidence doesn't threaten a woman's reputation as his opening move. He threatens reputation when the facts themselves won't hold." She turned to Nathaniel, something resolute settling into her expression. "We need Constance Abernathy's case moved forward alongside this one. If the court can see in the same session that my corrections have twice now uncovered genuine fraud Fenwick's boundary, and now potentially her husband's true will, it becomes far harder for Hale to paint me as a woman inventing errors for her own advantage." "You mean to fight two cases at once?" "I mean to prove," Eleanor said, "that the pattern of my work speaks louder than Hale's accusations ever could." The following days passed in a blur of documents and depositions. Eleanor moving between her small office, the courthouse archives, and increasingly frequent visits to Constance Abernathy, whose journey to King William County had, as Eleanor suspected, uncovered exactly what she'd hoped to find: a later will properly witnessed by the lawyer Halloway, explicitly favoring the widow over the contesting nephew. But it was on the fourth day, as Eleanor sat reviewing the newly recovered will alongside Nathaniel in her cramped office, that Margaret Ann Pruitt arrived unannounced, her face pale and her breathing quick from having hurried the distance from her house. "Eleanor," she said, "you need to hear this before it reaches you from someone crueler." "What's happened?" "There's a rumor moving through the city," Margaret Ann said, glancing uneasily at Nathaniel before continuing. "Hale's been telling anyone who'll listen that you didn't simply correct Fenwick's deed, that you and Fenwick conspired together from the start, that the whole affair was arranged between you before you ever set foot in his shop that day. He's suggesting," she hesitated, clearly, reluctant to say the words aloud, "he's suggesting an impropriety between you and Mr. Fenwick to explain why a married woman would go to such lengths for a stranger's land." The color drained slowly from Eleanor's face, not from shock exactly, but from a colder, more familiar recognition. The recognition of a woman who understood precisely how effectively such a rumor once spoken aloud in the right rooms could unmake everything she had built. "That's a lie," she said, her voice tight. "A vicious, calculated lie." "I know that," Margaret Ann said. "But you know as well as I do, Eleanor, that a lie repeated by enough respectable voices becomes indistinguishable from truth in the minds of people eager to believe the worst of a woman working outside her expected place." Nathaniel had gone very still beside her, his expression darkening into something Eleanor had never seen from him before. Not the careless irritation he might once have shown, but a controlled, simmering fury that seemed for the first time entirely on her behalf rather than his own wounded pride. "Where did you hear this?" he asked. "From Mrs. Ashford, of all people," Margaret Ann said. "She came to warn me, in fact, said she'd heard it from her husband, who'd heard it at the tavern near the courthouse. She was horrified by it, Eleanor. She wanted you to know before it spread further." Eleanor sat in silence for a long moment, her hands pressed flat against the desk before her, steadying herself against a wave of fury and fear she refused to let show on her face. "He means to destroy me entirely," she said finally. "Not simply discredit my correction to the deed. He means to make it impossible for any respectable family in this county to seek my help again, regardless of how the boundary case is settled." "Then we stop him," Nathaniel said, his voice low and hard. "Whatever it costs." The circuit court convened 8 days later, the small courtroom packed tighter than Eleanor had ever seen it, word of the dispute having spread far beyond the merchants and lawyers who typically attended such proceedings. She recognized faces from the dinner at the Carter estate, scattered among the benches, Colonel Whitfield near the front, his expression unreadable. Mrs. Ashford seated near the back, offering Eleanor a small encouraging nod as she entered. Even Margaret Carter arriving late and seating herself near the rear of the room. Her presence there a surprise to both Eleanor and Nathaniel, that neither had time to properly consider before the judge called the proceedings to order. Judge Harlan Voss, a stern, gray-haired man, known throughout the county for his impatience with theatrics, surveyed the crowded room with visible displeasure before turning his attention to Prescott Hale. "Mr. Hale, you've brought a boundary dispute before this court, along with, I understand, certain additional accusations against Mrs. Carter. I trust you intend to address the boundary itself before we entertain any further theater." "Of course, Your Honor," Hale said smoothly, rising to present his case. He walked the court through the discovery of Ezra Thorne's survey with practiced confidence, presenting the document as though its very age lent it unquestionable authority, describing Whitcomb's family as diligent stewards of a boundary long obscured by careless record-keeping on Fenwick's side. When it came time for Eleanor to respond, she rose with her documents in hand, her voice steady, despite the weight of every eye in the room settling upon her. "Your Honor, I would first draw the court's attention to the surveyor whose work Mr. Hale asks us to trust above a witnessed physical boundary that has stood unquestioned for 2 decades. She laid out Thorne's revoked license, the formal complaints filed against him in 1789, the fact that no independent record existed of the survey ever having been conducted. Only Whitcomb family papers, conveniently produced the very week a correction threatened their claim to the land. Furthermore, Eleanor continued, county law requires that any survey establishing a property boundary be filed within a reasonable period following its completion. 30 years of silence broken only now is itself grounds for this court to view the document's authenticity with considerable skepticism. Hale rose immediately. Your Honor, Mrs. Carter's argument, however technically sound, does nothing to address the more troubling matter at hand, namely, whether a woman with no legal training or credentials has any standing to make such corrections in the first place, and whether her relationship with Mr. Fenwick was from its outset entirely what it appeared to be. A murmur moved through the courtroom, and Eleanor felt her pulse quicken, though she kept her expression composed. Your Honor, she said before the judge could respond, if Mr. Hale wishes to accuse me of impropriety, I would ask that he do so plainly before this court, rather than allowing insinuation to do the work that evidence cannot. Hale hesitated, clearly unprepared for the directness of the challenge, and it was Judge Voss who spoke next, his voice sharp with irritation. Mr. Hale, If you have evidence of impropriety, present it now. If you do not, I'll thank you to confine your arguments to the boundary dispute before this court and leave gossip to the tavern where it belongs." Hale's composure cracked visibly for the first time. "Your Honor, I merely suggest that the timing and nature of Mrs. Carter's involvement—" "You suggest," Judge Voss cut in, "without evidence, which in my courtroom amounts to nothing more than slander dressed up as legal argument. Do you have evidence, Mr. Hale, or don't you?" The silence that followed stretched long and damning. Hale glanced toward Whitcomb, seated near the front, whose own expression had shifted from confident to visibly uneasy. "I do not, Your Honor." Hale admitted finally, the words clearly costing him. "Then strike the insinuation from this proceeding entirely," Judge Voss said, "and let us return to the matter of the boundary itself, which, based on what I've heard this morning, appears considerably less complicated than Mr. Hale's presentation suggested." It took less than 20 minutes more for the judge to rule decisively in Fenwick's favor, dismissing Thorne's survey as inadmissible, given its questionable provenance, and the surveyor's own documented history of inaccurate work, and affirming the original boundary, as established by the witnessed stone wall. Fenwick, seated near the front, let out an audible breath of relief, and across the room, Eleanor felt the tight coil of tension in her chest finally begin to loosen. But the moment was not yet finished. "Before this court adjourns," Judge Voss said, his gaze moving deliberately toward Eleanor, "I find myself compelled to note something rather unusual about these proceedings. In 22 years presiding over this circuit, I have rarely seen a boundary dispute resolved with such clarity, nor a survey's flaws exposed with such precision." He paused, studying Eleanor with an expression that carried unexpectedly something like respect. "Mrs. Carter, I understand you have assisted with several other matters in this county in recent weeks. Should any of them require formal review before this court, I would welcome the thoroughness you've demonstrated today, regardless of what credentials you may or may not hold on paper." The words landed in the courtroom like something Eleanor had not dared to hope for. Not simply vindication against Hale's cruel insinuations, but open public acknowledgement from the county's own presiding judge that her work carried genuine merit. A ripple of murmured approval moved through the gallery. Colonel Whitfield, Eleanor noticed, was nodding slowly, his weathered face creased with something like satisfaction. Mrs. Ashford was smiling openly, unashamed of her approval. And near the back of the room, Margaret Carter sat perfectly still, her expression unreadable, though her eyes remained fixed on Eleanor with an intensity that suggested the older woman's carefully guarded certainties had been shaken more deeply than she was yet prepared to admit.
Bien cooking.
Outside the courthouse, as the crowd dispersed into the warm afternoon, Fenwick approached Eleanor directly, pulling his hat from his head in a gesture of genuine gratitude. "Mrs. Carter, I don't know how to thank you properly. You didn't just save my land today. You silenced a man who tried to ruin your name to do it. You have nothing to thank me for that isn't already repaid, Mr. Fenwick," Eleanor said. "You trusted a stranger's judgment when you had every reason not to. That trust mattered more than you know." As Fenwick moved off to celebrate with his family, Nathaniel stepped closer to Eleanor's side, his expression carrying an emotion she had not seen from him before, something that looked almost like awe. "I've never seen anything like that," he said quietly. "Hale came into that courtroom certain he'd already won, and you dismantled him piece by piece without ever raising your voice." "I had the truth on my side," Eleanor said. "That matters more than volume in the end." "It matters," Nathaniel agreed. "But it isn't the only thing that mattered today. You could have simply defended the boundary and let the insinuation about Fenwick pass unanswered, hoping it would fade on its own. You didn't. You forced Hale to either produce evidence or admit before the entire county that he had none." "I've spent enough of my life," Eleanor said quietly, "allowing insinuation to stand unanswered because confronting it directly felt too dangerous, too unseemly for a woman to attempt. I am finished doing that, Nathaniel. Whatever else changes or does not change between us, that much has changed permanently in me." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment, studying her with an expression that had shifted sometime in these past weeks from uncertain hope into something steadier, something that resembled genuine admiration rather than mere obligation. "I owe you an apology," he said finally, "for a great many things beyond that dinner table." "You've already apologized for the dinner table," Eleanor said. "What else do you owe me for?" "For every year I let you carry this weight alone," Nathaniel said, "without ever once asking what it cost you. For every letter you wrote in my name that I took credit for without thought. For assuming all this time that your silence in our marriage meant contentment, when it meant only that you'd stopped believing I was capable of hearing you." Eleanor felt something tighten in her throat, unexpected and unwelcome. A fragile crack in the composure she had maintained through every difficult moment of the past weeks. She did not answer immediately, and Nathaniel, seeming to understand that some silences required patience rather than filling, said nothing more. Simply standing beside her in the warm afternoon light as the last of the courthouse crowd dispersed around them. It was Margaret Carter's voice unexpectedly that broke the quiet. "Eleanor." Both of them turned. Margaret stood a short distance away, her posture as rigid as ever, though something in her face had shifted since the dinner. 2 weeks passed, a tightness around her eyes that had not been there before, the look of a woman forced to reconsider certainties she had held her entire adult life. "I heard everything the judge said today," Margaret continued, her voice carrying none of its usual cool authority. "I have spent 3 years believing that a woman's value lay entirely in her grace, her composure, her ability to reflect well upon her husband's household. I raised my son to believe the same." She paused, and for the first time since Eleanor had known her, something like difficulty entered the older woman's voice. "I do not know that I am prepared to abandon everything I believe simply because a judge praised your arithmetic. But I watched you today, and I find myself unable to dismiss what I witnessed as easily as I dismissed it before." It was not an apology. Eleanor understood that clearly and did not mistake it for one. But it was perhaps the first honest crack in a certainty that had shaped 3 years of quiet cruelty, and Eleanor found to her own surprise that she did not need it to be more than that, not yet. "That is more than I expected from you, Margaret," Eleanor said quietly. "I do not ask you to change your beliefs overnight. I ask only that you continue watching with the same honesty you've shown today." Margaret held her gaze a moment longer, then gave a single stiff nod and turned to walk toward her waiting carriage without another word. Nathaniel watched his mother go, then turned back to Eleanor, something resolved settling into his expression. "Come back to Richmond with me," he said. "Not to my office, not to watch from a bench. I want to help you build what you're building here properly this time, if you'll let me." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, in the fading afternoon light, weighing 3 years of quiet dismissal against 3 weeks of hard, unglamorous proof, and found for the first time since she had packed her father's ledgers into a wooden trunk and disappeared before dawn, that she was no longer entirely certain where the boundary between her old life and her new one truly lay. "Walk with me," she said finally, "and we'll see what we can build." The weeks that followed the courtroom victory settled into something Eleanor had not expected to find in this stage of her life, a rhythm that felt for the first time since her wedding day entirely her own to shape. Nathaniel kept his word. He did not return to the estate and leave her to Richmond alone, nor did he attempt to fold her work into his own authority the way she had half feared he might, once his pride recovered from the sting of watching her succeed without him. Instead, he rented a small set of rooms 2 streets from her office, close enough to be present, distant enough to prove he understood the difference between support and control. "You're here again," Eleanor said one morning, finding him already seated outside her office door as she arrived, a satchel of papers under his arm. "I told you I intended to learn properly," Nathaniel said. "I've spent the week reviewing Whitlock's notes on contract law. I thought if you'd permit it, I might be of some use reading through initial complaints, so your time isn't spent on matters that don't require your particular skill." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, weighing the offer against 3 years of him never once asking what her days contained. "You want to be my clerk?" "I want to be useful," Nathaniel said. "If clerk is the word for it, I'll take the title without complaint. It was Eleanor thought as she unlocked the office door, an almost unrecognizable version of the man who had once stood at the head of his own table and called her undecorative before 40 witnesses. She did not trust the transformation completely. Trust she had learned was not rebuilt in a single season, however sincere the effort, but she found herself morning after morning less braced for disappointment than she had been the week before. The work itself did not slow even with Whitcomb's case resolved, and Hale's reputation quietly permanently diminished among the county's respectable circles. If anything, the courtroom victory had the opposite effect. Hale had intended drawing more families to Eleanor's door, rather than fewer, each arriving with the particular desperation of people who had exhausted every other avenue before considering a woman's help. It was on a warm morning in early August that Constance Abernathy returned to the office, her case now fully settled in her favor, carrying with her not gratitude alone, but a proposition that would in time reshape everything Eleanor had built. "Mrs. Carter," the widow said, seating herself carefully across from Eleanor's desk. "I've spoken with several women in my circle since my case was resolved. Widows mostly, and a few wives whose husbands travel often and leave estate matters entirely in their hands, whether by choice or by necessity. They've heard what you did for me and for Mr. Fenwick, and they wonder—" She hesitated, glancing briefly at Nathaniel, who sat near the window reviewing a stack of papers. "They wonder whether you might consider taking on more of us, formally, I mean. Not simply as favors granted when trouble arises, but as an ongoing arrangement." Eleanor set down her pen slowly. "You're suggesting I establish some manner of practice?" "I'm suggesting," Constance said, "that there are more women in this county who need exactly what you offer than you might realize, and precious few places they can turn without being dismissed, patronized, or charged triple what a man would pay for the same service." She paused. "I have some means, Mrs. Carter, since my husband's estate was properly settled. I would be glad to help fund such an undertaking if you were willing to consider it." Eleanor glanced toward Nathaniel, who had lowered his papers entirely, his attention fixed on the conversation with an intensity that told her he understood better than she might have expected the significance of what was being offered. "It's a substantial undertaking," Eleanor said carefully, though something in her chest had already begun to quicken at the thought. "It would require proper office space, perhaps a second set of hands eventually, if the demand proves as great as you suggest." "Then let it require those things," Constance said simply. "You saved my inheritance, Mrs. Carter. I intend to see that the next widow who needs saving doesn't have to rely on the same fortunate accident of overhearing a conversation in a dry goods store." Eleanor sat with the proposal for a long moment after Constance had gone, staring at the ledger before her without truly seeing it, and it was Nathaniel who finally broke the silence. "You should do it," he said. "You have an opinion on the matter." "I have several," Nathaniel said, "though I recognize the decision isn't mine to make. But Eleanor, you've spent weeks proving one case at a time that your mind belongs in rooms it was never meant to enter. Constance is offering you the chance to make that permanent, to build something that outlasts any single boundary dispute or contested will. And what would that mean for us?" Eleanor asked the question, arriving before she had fully decided to voice it. "If I build something permanent here in Richmond, apart from the estate." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment, and Eleanor watched him consider the question with the same careful attention he now brought to every account he reviewed. "It would mean," he said slowly, "that whatever marriage we build going forward has to be built around two lives with real weight in them, rather than one life bending entirely around the other. I won't pretend that doesn't unsettle me, Eleanor. I was raised to believe a wife's work orbited her husband's, not the reverse. But I've spent enough weeks now watching what you've built to know that asking you to abandon it would be asking you to become smaller again. And I find I no longer have any appetite for making you smaller." Turkey. The decision once made moved quickly. Within 2 weeks, Eleanor had secured a proper office on the ground floor of a modest building near the courthouse, its front window lettered simply with her name, E. Whitmore Estate and Land. Matters a small but deliberate choice to use the name that had first found her. These opportunities, rather than the name that had once made her invisible. Margaret Ann Pruitt attended the opening with unconcealed pride, and Josiah Fenwick sent unexpectedly a small brass plaque engraved with her name to hang beside the door, along with a note that read simply, "For the woman who taught this city that a sharp mind wears no particular face." But it was Margaret Carter's presence at the small gathering that surprised Eleanor most. The older woman arrived late, dressed in her customary black, and stood near the back of the modest crowd for nearly half the event before finally approaching Eleanor directly. "I did not expect to find myself here," Margaret said by way of greeting. "Nor did I expect to see you," Eleanor said honestly. "Nathaniel did not invite me," Margaret said. "I invited myself. I find I have questions I did not know how to ask him directly." She glanced around the small office at the shelves of ledgers, the framed deed Eleanor had corrected for Fenwick hanging near the window, as a kind of quiet monument to where all of this had begun. "I have spent 3 years believing that a woman who occupied herself with matters such as these had somehow failed at being a proper wife. I am beginning to wonder whether I simply never understood what a proper wife could accomplish given the chance." "That is a considerable admission for you, Margaret," Eleanor said carefully. "It is not yet an apology," Margaret said. "I do not know that I am capable of one, not fully, not yet. Pride is a difficult thing to set down after 50 years of carrying it. But I find myself more days than not thinking of the woman my son married, rather than the woman I decided she should become. That is new for me, Eleanor. I do not know what to make of it." Eleanor considered the older woman for a long moment, recognizing in her admission something she had once demanded of Nathaniel himself, not perfection, not immediate transformation, but honest, difficult movement in the right direction. "That is enough for now," Eleanor said. "More than I expected, in truth." The practice grew faster than either Eleanor or Nathaniel had anticipated. By the end of August, she had taken on 2 more cases each week than she could comfortably manage alone. And it was Nathaniel increasingly who found himself handling the preliminary intake, listening to a family's troubles, gathering the relevant documents, organizing them for Eleanor's review, with a competence that surprised even him. It was during this period that the deeper shift in their marriage began to take shape, not through grand declarations, but through the accumulation of small, ordinary moments. Neither of them had permitted themselves in 3 years of marriage supper eaten together over case files, rather than in stiff silence at a formal table, arguments about legal strategy that ended in genuine laughter, rather than wounded pride. Evenings when Nathaniel read aloud from a contested will while Eleanor worked through the accompanying ledger, both of them absorbed in a shared task rather than performing separate roles for an audience that no longer existed between them. "I don't think I ever truly spoke with you before this summer," Nathaniel admitted one evening as they sat together in her small office, long after the last client had gone, the lamp burning low. "Not really. I spoke at you, or near you. But I don't believe I ever asked what you thought, and waited to hear the actual answer." "No," Eleanor agreed. "You didn't?" "I find I prefer this," Nathaniel said, "whatever this is." "It's a marriage, Nathaniel," Eleanor said, though there was, for the first time, something almost warm in her voice as she said it. "Simply one neither of us knew how to build before now." But the fragile peace they had constructed was not to remain untested for long. It was in the second week of September that Whitcomb, still smarting from his defeat in the Boundary case, and unwilling to accept the quiet dismantling of his family's claim, made his final and most dangerous move, not through Hale, whose reputation had suffered too badly to be of further use to him, but through a formal petition filed directly with the Virginia legislature, arguing that women engaging in legal and financial advisory work without formal credentials posed a danger to the orderly conduct of the county's affairs, and requesting that such practices be explicitly prohibited by statute. Eleanor learned of the petition from Whitlock, who arrived at her office with a grim expression and a copy of the filed document in hand. "He's not content to lose one case," Whitlock said, laying the papers before her. "He means to ensure no woman in this state can ever do what you've done again." Eleanor read through the petition with mounting disbelief, the careful legal language dressing up what was at its core an act of pure vindictiveness, an attempt to erase through legislation the very possibility of the work she had built. "This could pass," she said quietly, looking up at Whitlock. "Couldn't it?" "It's not impossible," Whitlock admitted. "There are men in the legislature who share Whitcomb's view of a woman's proper place, and Hale's earlier insinuations, however discredited, may have left enough residue of suspicion for some of them to find the petition appealing, regardless of your record of success." Eleanor felt the floor of her carefully constructed new life tilt beneath her, and it was Nathaniel entering the office moments later and finding her pale and still over the papers, who first spoke the question neither of them wanted to voice aloud. "What happens to everything you've built if this passes?" "Everything stops," Eleanor said, her voice tight with a fear she rarely allowed herself to show. "Not just my practice. Every woman who might have followed the path I've made. Whitcomb isn't merely attacking me, Nathaniel. He's attempting to close the door before anyone else can walk through it." Nathaniel's expression hardened into the same controlled fury Eleanor had seen from him only once before outside the courthouse, when Hale had first threatened her. "Then we close the door on him first." "How?" Eleanor asked. "This isn't a boundary dispute I can dismantle with a surveyor's revoked license. This is the entire legislature, Nathaniel. Men who've never once had to justify their own competence being asked to decide whether women deserve the chance to prove theirs." Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a resolve Eleanor had never heard from him before their marriage's slow, difficult unmaking and remaking. "Then we give them a reason to see what I've seen," he said. "We gather every case you've resolved, every family you've saved from ruin, every judge, every merchant, every widow who owes their security to your work. We make it impossible for the legislature to pretend this petition serves anyone but Whitcomb's wounded pride." "That could take weeks we may not have," Eleanor said. "Then we'd best begin tonight," Nathaniel said. The following days became a blur of letters and testimonials. Eleanor and Nathaniel working late into each night compiling a record of every case she had touched since that first afternoon in Fenwick's shop. Josiah Fenwick wrote a letter so forceful in its praise that Eleanor found herself blinking back unexpected tears reading it aloud. Constance Abernathy traveled personally to Richmond's legislative offices to speak on Eleanor's behalf, refusing to be turned away by clerks who found her presence irregular. Even Judge Voss, breaking with the customary reticence of his position, provided a formal letter noting the unusual precision and integrity of the work Eleanor had brought before his court. But it was Margaret Carter's contribution that surprised Eleanor most deeply. She arrived at the office unannounced on a gray, humid afternoon, a folded letter in her gloved hand, her expression carrying none of its usual composed certainty. "I've written something," Margaret said without preamble. "I don't know that it will matter to men who've already decided their minds. But I found I could not stay silent while a petition attempted to erase a woman's right to do what my own son's estate would have suffered without." Eleanor took the letter with careful hands, reading through Margaret's precise formal script, an account plainly written of Margaret's own initial resistance to Eleanor's work, her gradual and difficult recognition of its value, and a direct appeal to the legislature's sense of practical reason over inherited prejudice. "You wrote this," Eleanor said when she had finished, her voice unsteady. "I did," Margaret said. "I am not perhaps the ally you would have chosen for this fight, but I find myself unwilling to watch a legislature enshrine into law the very blindness I once carried in my own heart. If my name lends any weight to your cause, you may use it as you see fit." Eleanor looked up at the older woman, seeing for the first time since she had known her, not the rigid guardian of old certainties, but a woman genuinely painfully reconsidering the foundations of a life she had built. "Thank you, Margaret," Eleanor said quietly. "This means more than you may realize." The legislative session convened on a sweltering afternoon in late September, the chamber crowded with representatives from across the state. Whitcomb seated prominently near the front, his expression carrying the same confident smugness Eleanor remembered from Hale's approach outside the courthouse months before. Eleanor was not permitted to speak directly before the assembled body, a bitter irony that was not lost on her given the subject of the petition itself. But Whitlock retained now not merely as the Carter family's lawyer, but as Eleanor's own advocate, rose to present the case against Whitcomb's proposal, laying out case after case, letter after letter, testimony after testimony, documenting the tangible good Eleanor's work had done throughout the county. "Gentlemen," Whitlock said, his voice carrying clearly through the crowded chamber, "the petitioner asks you to prohibit by law the very kind of careful, precise work that has saved a farmer's inheritance, secured a widow's rightful estate, and exposed fraud that no credentialed lawyer in this county had thought to examine closely enough to find. I ask you to consider plainly whether the danger this petition claims to address is a danger at all, or whether it is simply the discomfort of men unaccustomed to seeing competence in a form they did not expect." Whitcomb rose in response, his voice tight with barely restrained anger. "The issue, gentlemen, is not competence. It is precedent. If we permit women to practice legal and financial advisory work without credential or oversight, we open the door to disorder in every county in this state. Today, it is Mrs. Carter, careful and precise by her own account. Tomorrow, it may be women far less scrupulous exploiting the same precedent without her particular skill." It was Judge Voss's letter read aloud by Whitlock in the proceedings' final moments that seemed finally to tip the room's uncertain mood. "In 22 years presiding over this circuit," the letter read, "I have seen more disorder caused by credentialed men practicing carelessly than I have ever witnessed from the single woman whose work is now in question. I would ask this body to consider whether the true danger to this state's orderly affairs lies in permitting competent work to continue, or in legislating away competence itself out of discomfort with its source." The vote, when it finally came, was closer than Eleanor had dared to hope. Not a resounding defeat of Whitcomb's petition, but a defeat nonetheless, the measure failing by a margin narrow enough to remind Eleanor how fragile the ground beneath her still remained, even after everything she had built. Whitcomb left the chamber without a word, his face rigid with fury, and Eleanor felt watching him go. Not triumph exactly, but a kind of hard-won relief, tempered by the clear understanding that this fight, however, won today, was unlikely to be the last of its kind. That evening, Nathaniel found her still at her office long after the legislative session had ended, sitting quietly at her desk with the day's letters spread before her, her expression distant. "You should be celebrating," he said gently, taking the seat across from her. "I am relieved," Eleanor said. "I am not certain relief and celebration are the same thing tonight, Nathaniel. The vote was close. Closer than it should have been given everything we presented. There will be other Whitcombs, other petitions, other men convinced that my competence is somehow a danger simply because it arrived in an unexpected shape." "Perhaps," Nathaniel said. "But tonight at least the door remains open, and every case you take on from here forward makes it harder for the next petition to close it." Eleanor considered this, some of the day's tension slowly easing from her shoulders. "You argued well for me today, Nathaniel. I heard from Whitlock how much of the testimony you gathered yourself." "I had considerable motivation," Nathaniel said. "Watching everything you built threatened by a man too proud to accept a fair defeat." He paused, something more careful entering his expression. "Eleanor, I've been thinking these past weeks about what comes next for us. Not simply for the practice, though I hope that continues to grow exactly as it has. I mean for the two of us, for whatever we're building here beyond the work." Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "What are you asking, Nathaniel?" "I'm asking," he said, "whether you'd consider making Richmond and this life we've built here permanent, not as a temporary arrangement while you punish me for old failures, and not as a reluctant return to the estate simply because tradition demands it. I mean, a genuine choice made freely about what kind of marriage we want going forward." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, weighing the question against everything the summer had taught her about her own capabilities, about the fragile, difficult work of rebuilding trust, about a man who had, however, slowly and imperfectly proven himself willing to change in ways she had never believed him capable of when she'd packed her father's ledgers into a trunk and disappeared before dawn. "I am not the same woman who left your table in the middle of the night," she said finally. "I will not become smaller again, Nathaniel, for you, for your mother, for anyone's comfort. If we build something together going forward, It will be built on the understanding that my work matters as much as yours, that my voice carries equal weight at whatever table we sit at, and that what happened at that dinner 3 months ago never happens again in any form, however small." "Agreed," Nathaniel said without hesitation. "Entirely and permanently agreed." Eleanor studied him a moment longer, searching as she always did for the seams where sincerity might give way to old habit, and found instead only steady, unwavering resolve. "Then perhaps," she said slowly, "it's time we discussed what this marriage looks like properly before either of us assumes too much about its shape." Outside, the last light of the September evening was fading over the rooftops of Richmond, and somewhere beyond the city, the Carter estate sat waiting. Not as the house Eleanor had fled in the dark, but as a place whose future for the first time in 3 years remained genuinely uncertainly open-shaped by two people finally willing to build it together, rather than one bending silently around the other's expectations. The conversation that followed lasted long past midnight, the two of them working through what a marriage built on equal footing might actually require in practice, rather than in principle. Eleanor insisted on terms that would have been unthinkable to speak aloud 3 months earlier: a formal share in the estate's management decisions, recognition of her Richmond practice as permanent rather than provisional, an understanding that any future disagreement between them would be settled through conversation, rather than one voice simply overruling the other by virtue of custom. Nathaniel agreed to each point with a steadiness that told Eleanor he had spent real hours turning these questions over before she ever raised them. "There's one more matter," Eleanor said as the lamp burned low, and the office around them had gone quiet except for the distant sound of a night watchman's footsteps on the street below. "Your mother." Nathaniel's jaw tightened slightly, though he did not look away. "What about her?" "She has softened," Eleanor said carefully, "more than I ever expected her to. But softening is not the same as changing, Nathaniel. If we return to the estate together permanently, I need to know she understands that the household she once ruled without question no longer answers only to her preferences." "I'll speak with her again," Nathaniel said, plainly this time not as a son seeking approval, but as a man stating how things will be. He paused. "Though I suspect after watching you dismantle Hale, and then an entire legislative petition in the same season, she may already understand that better than either of us gives her credit for." Eleanor allowed herself for the first time that long night something that was unmistakably a smile. "Perhaps," she said. "We'll see soon enough." Tapping. They returned to the Carter estate together on a cool morning in early October, the summer's heavy heat finally breaking into the crisp beginnings of autumn, the fields beyond the house turning gold at their edges. Eleanor rode beside Nathaniel in the carriage, not as a wife being delivered home after a long absence, but as a woman choosing deliberately and with clear eyes to build a life in a place that had once tried to erase her. Margaret was waiting on the front steps when they arrived, and Eleanor noted with quiet interest that the older woman had dressed with unusual care that morning, as though the occasion demanded something more than her customary black morning silk. "You've come home," Margaret said as Eleanor stepped down from the carriage. "I've come to build a home," Eleanor corrected gently. "Whether it becomes the one I left depends on what we're all willing to make of it." Margaret's mouth tightened briefly, an old reflex, before something else moved across her expression, a visible, deliberate choice to set the reflex aside. "Then let us begin building it properly," she said. "I have had the eastern parlor prepared as a study, should you wish for a private space to continue your work when you're not in Richmond. I understand from Nathaniel that such things matter to you." It was Eleanor recognized as close to an olive branch as Margaret Carter was likely capable of extending, and she accepted it with the same grace she had once been accused of lacking entirely. "Thank you, Margaret," Eleanor said. "That was thoughtfully done." The following weeks tested every promise made in that late-night office in Richmond, though not through any dramatic confrontation, but through the slower, more difficult work of ordinary life, reshaping itself around new expectations. There were moments Margaret's old habits resurfaced, a comment about propriety. Here, a raised eyebrow there, when Eleanor left for Richmond 3 days running to attend to her growing list of clients. But each time Nathaniel intervened before Eleanor needed to. his voice steady and unapologetic in a way that would have been unimaginable to the man who had once let his mother's opinions govern his marriage without protest. "You corrected her again this morning," Eleanor observed one evening as they sat together in the eastern parlor that had become in the weeks since her return. Genuinely, her own shelves lined with ledgers, a wide desk positioned to catch the morning light, the framed deed from Fenwick's case hanging on the wall beside a smaller frame containing Judge Voss's letter. "She implied you were neglecting your duties here by spending time in Richmond," Nathaniel said. "I told her that a woman managing 2 households worth of responsibility, 1 legal practice, and my own education in matters I should have understood years ago was hardly neglecting anything. You didn't have to defend me so sharply." "I wanted to," Nathaniel said simply. "I spent 3 years failing to defend you at all, Eleanor. I find I have a great deal of time to make up for." It was in these small, accumulating moments, not the grand courtroom victories or the dramatic legislative votes, but the quiet daily choice to stand beside rather than apart, that Eleanor found herself slowly and without quite noticing the exact moment it happened, beginning to trust the man she had married, rather than merely tolerate his presence in her rebuilt life. The practice in Richmond continued to grow through the autumn, and by November Eleanor had taken on a young clerk, a serious, quick-minded woman named Harriet Voss, Judge Voss's own niece. As it happened, a coincidence that amused Eleanor considerably when Harriet first arrived at her door seeking employment. "My uncle speaks of you often," Harriet admitted on her first day in the office. "He says you've done more to sharpen the county's legal standards than any lawyer he's overseen in 20 years. "Your uncle is generous," Eleanor said, "though I suspect he simply enjoys watching men like Hale humbled in his courtroom." "That too," Harriet agreed with a small smile that told Eleanor she had found in this quick, capable young woman someone who might one day carry this work forward long after Eleanor herself had grown too old to manage it alone. It was Harriet's presence, in fact, that prompted the final and most significant test of everything Eleanor and Nathaniel had built that autumn, not through any external threat, but through a decision that would determine more clearly than any courtroom victory exactly what kind of future they intended to build together. The letter arrived on the gray morning in late November, addressed to Eleanor directly bearing the seal of the Virginia General Assembly. Eleanor's hands were not quite steady as she broke the wax memories of Whitcomb's petition rising immediately to mind. But the letter, when she read it, contained not another attack, but something she had never dared to imagine possible 3 months earlier, a formal invitation to appear before a legislative committee reviewing standards for land record accuracy across the state, to provide testimony on the kinds of errors and fraud she had uncovered in her work, and to offer recommendations for reform that might prevent such disputes from arising in the first place. "They want your expertise," Nathaniel said, reading over her shoulder, his voice carrying open astonishment. "Not despite the fact that you're a woman working outside the credentialed profession, but because of the very work that made you one." "It's extraordinary," Eleanor said, still staring at the letter as though it might dissolve if she looked away. 3 months ago, this same body nearly voted to prohibit the very work they're now asking me to help improve statewide. "The vote was close," Nathaniel reminded her gently. "It seems enough of them remembered which side of that vote proved wiser." Eleanor sat with the letter for a long moment, feeling the full weight of the distance she had traveled since that candlelit dinner where a single cruel sentence had emptied her house before dawn. She thought of Fenwick's trembling hands as he'd folded that first corrected deed. She thought of Constance Abernathy's tears of relief. She thought of Judge Voss's unexpected praise, and Margaret Carter's halting, difficult reconsideration, and the narrow, hard-won vote that had kept the door open for women like Harriet to walk through it after her. "I'll accept," she said finally, "though I intend to bring more than my own testimony. I intend to bring every case, every name, every family this work has touched, so that whatever standards they build going forward are built on the real evidence of what happens when competence is allowed to matter more than convention." The testimony delivered before the assembled committee on a cold December morning was the most thoroughly prepared work Eleanor had ever presented. Months of case records, organized with the same meticulous precision, she brought to every deed and ledger, supported by letters from Fenwick Abernathy, Judge Voss. And in a gesture that still occasionally caught Eleanor by surprise, when she thought of it from Margaret Carter herself, whose account of her own transformed understanding proved unexpectedly persuasive among committee members who might otherwise have dismissed a wife's advocate as biased beyond usefulness. "Gentlemen," Eleanor said, standing before the committee with a composure that no longer required any performance to maintain, "I do not ask you to legislate based on my particular story alone. I ask you to consider the pattern beneath it. Every case I have resolved began with an error that a credentialed professional either missed or chose not to examine closely enough to find. The common thread was never my gender. It was attention, the willingness to look as carefully at a small farmer's 40 acres as at a wealthy landowner's 1,000. I would ask this body to consider standards that reward that attention regardless of who provides it." The committee's questions ran long into the afternoon, probing skeptical in places, but never dismissive in the way Eleanor had once braced herself to expect. By the session's end, the chairman, an older man with the same weathered gravity Eleanor recognized from Colonel Whitfield's manner at that first fateful dinner, thanked her for testimony he described without exaggeration as the most substantive the committee had received in its current session. Nathaniel was waiting for her outside the chamber, and the look on his face when she emerged told her before he spoke a single word exactly how the afternoon had struck him. "You've changed the shape of things," he said quietly. "Not just for yourself, for every woman who comes after you." "We've changed it," Eleanor corrected. "I could not have built any of this without a partner willing to stand beside the work, rather than simply admire it from a distance." It was that evening in the quiet of the Carter estate's eastern parlor, the December fire burning low and steady against the early winter cold, that Nathaniel raised the question that had been forming Eleanor suspected since long before the legislative invitation had ever arrived. "I've been thinking," he said, "about the dinner where all of this began. Not with regret exactly, though certainly with regret too, but I keep returning to a particular thought." "What thought is that?" "That the version of myself who said those words to you," Nathaniel said, "believed without ever examining the belief closely that a wife's value lay in decoration, in the way she reflected on a husband's household, rather than in what she herself built, or thought, or wanted. I have spent 6 months watching you prove beyond any argument I could construct exactly how wrong that belief was. And I find myself wanting to say something more permanent than an apology delivered once at a single dinner, however public." Eleanor set down the letter she had been reviewing, giving him her full attention. "What would you propose instead?" "I want to hold another dinner," Nathaniel said. "Not to apologize again, that work is done, and I believe you've accepted it as thoroughly as I could ask. I want to hold a dinner to celebrate what you've built. Your practice, Harriet's apprenticeship under you, the legislative testimony. I want the same table where I once called you undecorative to become the table where this county formally recognizes what you are." Eleanor considered the proposal for a long moment, memory moving back across 6 months that had reshaped not only her marriage, but her entire understanding of what her own life might contain. "I would like that," she said finally, "though I would add one condition." "Name it." "Harriet attends as an honored guest," Eleanor said, not as my clerk observing from the margins. "If this dinner is meant to mark a change in how this county understands a woman's worth, it should mark it for more than one woman alone." "Agreed," Nathaniel said without hesitation, exactly as he had agreed to every condition she had set since that first difficult conversation in Margaret Ann Pruitt's parlor. The dinner took place in mid-December, the same long table set once more beneath the same crystal chandeliers, though the room itself felt to Eleanor entirely transformed from the space where she had once sat in humiliated silence. Colonel Whitfield attended again, along with the Ashfords, whose own marriage had grown warmer, Eleanor noted, in the months since young Mrs. Ashford had first witnessed Eleanor's public defiance. Judge Voss attended as well, an unusual departure from his customary reserve, along with Josiah Fenwick and his wife, and Constance Abernathy, seated with quiet dignity near the center of the table, rather than at its margins. Harriet Voss sat beside Eleanor, her young face carrying a mixture of pride and nervous awareness of the significance of her presence there, and Margaret Carter, seated at Nathaniel's right hand, exactly as she always had been, wore an expression that had over 6 months settled into something Eleanor recognized now as genuine, if still occasionally reluctant respect. Nathaniel rose when the meal had progressed to its final course, his wine glass in hand, and the room quieted with none of the uncertain tension that had marked his previous speech at this same table. 6 months ago, he began, I stood at this table and made the greatest error of my life. I called my wife undecorative, believing in my carelessness that her worth could be measured by how gracefully she occupied a chair beside me. I have spent every day since learning exactly how wrong I was, and I no longer wish to speak only of my error. Tonight, I wish to speak of what she built in its wake. He turned to Eleanor, and the room's attention followed him. My wife has saved a farmer's inheritance from fraudulent claim. She has secured a widow's rightful estate against a scheming nephew. She has stood before this state's legislature and helped shape standards that will protect families across Virginia for generations to come, regardless of whether the hand that catches their errors happens to be a man's or a woman's. She has done this not despite being my wife, but as herself, fully and completely, in a way I spent 3 years too blind to see. He paused, and when he continued, his voice carried something rawer than performance, something Eleanor recognized now as entirely permanently sincere. I do not offer this toast as an apology tonight. That work, I believe, is finished between us. I offer it instead as a statement of fact for this table and this county to carry forward. Eleanor Whitmore Carter is not decoration. She never was. She is the finest mind I have ever known and the truest partner I could have asked for, and I am every day working to become a man worthy of standing beside her. The applause that followed was not scattered or hesitant, as it had been 6 months earlier. It was full, warm, unreserved, led by Colonel Whitfield's booming approval and Judge Voss's measured, dignified nod, and even Eleanor noted with quiet astonishment by Margaret Carter herself, who raised her own glass with a steadiness that told Eleanor the older woman's transformation, however slow and difficult its path, had finally genuinely arrived. Eleanor rose to answer, her gray-blue eyes moving across the table, across Fenwick's grateful pride, Constance's quiet dignity, Harriet's nervous hope, Margaret's hard-won respect, and finally Nathaniel's open, unguarded admiration. 6 months ago, she said, I left this table believing I would have to build my worth entirely alone, far from any place that had once dismissed it. I did not expect to find in time a husband willing to rebuild himself alongside me, or a household willing to reconsider what it once believed without question. I do not say this to suggest the work is finished. Change of this kind is never finished, not for one marriage, and not for one county's understanding of what a woman is capable of building. She paused, letting her gaze settle deliberately on Harriet. I say it instead to make a promise to this table and to whoever comes after us. The next woman who is called undecorative, or unsuitable, or unworthy of a seat at any table she has rightfully earned will find that the door I once had to force open on my own now stands considerably wider than it did before. The room rose to its feet, the applause echoing through the same hall where 6 months earlier Eleanor had sat in humiliated silence rather than risk the cost of speaking plainly. She felt standing there not triumph exactly, but something steadier and more permanent, the quiet certainty of a woman who had rebuilt her own worth from nothing but her own competence and her own refusal to disappear, and who had in the process rebuilt the marriage and the man beside her into something neither of them could have imagined on the night this story began. Later that evening, after the last guests had departed and the great house had settled into its familiar winter quiet, Eleanor stood once more in the eastern parlor that had become entirely her own, looking at the framed deed from Fenwick's case, the letter from Judge Voss, and now newly added a small notice announcing the Legislative Committee's adoption of the very reforms she had recommended in her December testimony. Nathaniel found her there, as he so often did now, drawn to the room that held the physical proof of everything his wife had built. "Regrets?" he asked quietly, coming to stand beside her. "None," Eleanor said, and meant it fully for the first time in longer than she could remember. I left this house believing I would have to choose between being valued and being myself. I have learned since that I never had to make that choice at all. I simply had to find people willing to see both at once. And did you find that here? Nathaniel asked. In the end, Eleanor turned to look at him fully, at the man who had once called her undecorative before 40 witnesses and had spent 6 months since proving action by patient action exactly how thoroughly he had come to understand his own error. I built it here, she said, with you finally rather than despite you. That is not the same as being given something I had not earned. It is better. It is mine, and it always will be. Outside, the December snow had begun to fall softly over the fields of the Carter estate, blanketing the land. Eleanor had once nearly lost the right to help manage the same land she had ridden across in the summer heat, while her husband stayed behind with his horses. The same land that now stood as quiet testament to a woman who had refused absolutely and permanently to let a single cruel sentence define the whole of her worth. She had left that table in silence, 3 months into a marriage that saw her as decoration. She returned to it finally as something no one at that table would ever again mistake her for being small enough to overlook. Eleanor Whitmore Carter had built her own value with her own 2 hands, and no voice, however cruel or careless, would ever again convince her to doubt it.